If you can close the door. Welcome to this hearing on a matter of serious concern to the respective committees. It's on the hearing on the misconduct or alleged misconduct of the NASA Inspector General. And we want to make a special welcome to our colleagues from the House Science Committee and its Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. Chairman Bart Gordon, the Chairman of the full committee, Chairman Miller, the Chairman of the Subcommittee. I want to welcome our colleague from Florida, Congressman Feeney, who is sitting in for the ranking member, Jim Sensenbrenner. And of course, our colleague here, Senator Hutchinson, the ranking member on this subcommittee. In April, we received the results of the Integrity Committee's investigation of the NASA Inspector General, Robert Cobb. And that independent panel found that Mr. Cobb had abused his office and failed to maintain the appropriate appearance of independence from the agency he is charged with monitoring. That's the conclusions of the committee. Based on those conclusions of the Integrity Committee, I joined Chairman Gordon and Chairman Miller in calling on President Bush to remove Mr. Cobb from office. My position has not changed. However, some of the conduct described in the Integrity Committee's report is so disturbing that it warrants additional investigation. I am particularly concerned with several specific instances of Mr. Cobb's misconduct. First, in 2002, foreign computer hackers gained access to sensitive information on a NASA computer, including NASA's most advanced rocket engines designs, estimated to be worth $1.9 billion. In such situations, federal export control laws require notification to the U.S. State Department. But Mr. Cobb ignored the advice of his staff and repeatedly blocked attempts to notify the State Department for fear that the disclosure would be embarrassing to NASA. As Exhibit 3 shows, when the Department of Defense was finally asked about the impact of this incident, they reported that the information disclosed may allow our adversaries to develop larger and more accurate ballistic missiles. Who are those adversaries? Adversaries with regard to rocket design are almost any country, not the least of which are Russia, China, North Korea, now Iran. You get the picture. The second incident, in December 2004 and again in 2005, Mr. Cobb delayed execution of search warrants in criminal investigations after those warrants had been sworn by an assistant U.S. attorney and was signed by a federal judge. The question of obstruction of justice arises. The third example, in June 2002, the Space Shuttle Endeavour was launched with one of the two required range safety systems inoperative. In order to launch, the launch criteria is that both must be operative. Despite the critical safety implications for NASA and the public. Mr. Cobb blocked a NASA OIG investigation, deferring instead to the Air Force, even when it became clear that the Air Force was not thoroughly investigating the matter. NASA is unique among federal agencies. Its mission is to expand the boundaries of exploration, push the limits of technology, and broaden our understanding of our own planet and the universe. And all of these activities carry considerable risk. In many cases, risk that can jeopardize the lives of NASA employees, and with regard to the range safety concerns, could jeopardize the populations of the nearby cities on the east coast of Florida. We've had too much experience in this with botched mistakes in the past, and we have lost 2 shuttles and 14 astronaut lives, first in '86 and again in '03. And investigators from those tragic events determined that a key contributor to the death of those 14 astronauts was a culture that discouraged employees from raising safety concerns. With this history in mind, it's particularly important for NASA employees to know about the concerns about safety, waste, fraud, and abuse, to know that all of that can be reported to a trustworthy Inspector General, and have the full confidence that that watchdog will pursue each case thoroughly, professionally, and independently. The investigations of those 2 shuttle tragedies was that instead of communication being a two-way street, it was from the top down, and the top management was not receiving the information from the bottom going up. Under Mr. Cobb's leadership, the Office of Inspector General at NASA has become dysfunctional. Fear and mistrust permeate the office. More than half of the experienced professionals in the office have left since Mr. Cobb's arrival. The boundaries, or the firewalls, between the IG and the agency's management have been trampled. The evidence shows us that these are not isolated instances, but a pattern of misconduct that continues even today. As recently as April the 10th, OIG employees raised new concerns about Mr. Cobb's independence from NASA management, and the NASA General Counsel destroyed government records in a bungled attempt at damage control related to the Cobb investigation. Whistleblowers who rely on the OIG to voice concerns about agency operations are unwilling to come forward, knowing that this IG will not respond favorably and may even allow retaliation from management against them. Congress depends on inspectors general as the first line of oversight at government agencies. That's the law. Without an effective inspector general at NASA, we have no choice but to increase the frequency and intensity of our own oversight activities. With each new revelation, I am more convinced that the current dysfunction in the NASA OIG is unrecoverable under the current leadership. I am hopeful that the information learned today will be helpful in reconstituting an effective OIG at NASA after Mr. Cobb's departure. Now, under the procedures that we have set up, Each of the respective leaders here will have an opening statement, and I would turn to Chairman Bart Gordon of the House Science and Technology Committee.
Thank you, Chairman Nelson. You know, it was 22 years since I was able to call you that when we were on the, you were chairman of the Space Subcommittee in the House of Representatives, and so I'm glad to refer to you as that again. And although this is not unprecedented, it's certainly unusual to have a joint hearing, which I think demonstrates to the public and to NASA that this is a very serious issue and that we take it very seriously, and we are very concerned that NASA is being compromised. In 2002, Mr. Cobb took on a very difficult job when he agreed to sign up to be Inspector General. IGs are probably held to the highest standard of any office in government. The expectations of integrity are so high because the job we set for IGs is so challenging. The purpose of the IGs, as stated in the 1978 Inspector General Act, is to act as an effective watchdogs on agencies from the inside by creating independent and objective offices. Those offices are charged with recommending policies to promote efficiency and effective administration of government and preventing, detecting fraud, waste, and abuse. It was expected that they would leave no stone unturned in searching for improper behavior. It's impossible to do that job if there is even a hint of misconduct on the part of the IG. And the lack of independence is a sure sign of a lack of objectiveness. If you view yourself as part of an agency's management team, you can't be an effective check on that management team. And it's very clear that from the very beginning, Mr. Cobb saw himself as a part of Sean O'Keefe's team. Senator Grassley was to testify here today, and I would like to quote at some length from his testimony. Senator Grassley noted this: "I'm alarmed by the evidence uncovered by the PCIE investigation. In fact, it appears that Mr. Cobb did not act in a manner consistent with the spirit and intent of that statute. According to the evidence, he has used this important position to interfere in the activities and conducted by the investigative and audit divisions within his office for reasons that appear, at the very least, improper. In fact, Mr. Cobb repeatedly told employees that one of his priorities was to avoid embarrassing NASA. Evidence also indicates that he shied away from bringing investigations against high-level NASA officials." Senator Grassley continues, and this is Senator Grassley: "It is clear to me that our ability to trust Mr. Cobb to effectively manage the Office of Inspector General and the vital functions that it seeks to carry out is in question. It seems that Mr. Cobb may care more about protecting NASA from embarrassment than he does about performing the critical functions of his office. An Inspector General must possess temperance, high ethical standards, and a firm understanding of the independent nature of that office. From the evidence presented, Mr. Cobb does not appear to possess those attributes." I want to concur today with Senator Grassley's comments. An IG has to conduct himself or herself in a fashion that Congress trusts them, that IG staffs believe in them, and that the whistleblower community relies on them. The current NASA IG has failed on every account. Mr. Cobb, you were chosen Inspector General not for your management skills or your experience in auditing, investigations, financial analysts, public administration, or any of the other skills that IGs by statute are supposed to possess. You were chosen to play ball with Sean O'Keefe. Because of that and your own actions, you have been highly unsuccessful as an Inspector General. I hope you will consider this, and for the sake of yourself and for NASA, you will do the right thing and you will resign. I yield back.
Chairman Miller, and of course each of our statements will be put in full in your prepared statement for the record. It will be a part of the record. Chairman Miller.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Good afternoon. In January, the Integrity Committee of the President's Council on Integrity and Efficiency completed its investigation of allegations of misconduct by Robert Moose Cobb, the Inspector General of NASA. After a 6-month investigation, the PCIE found that Mr. Cobb had abused his authority and exhibited the lack of independence or the appearance of or had exhibited the appearance of a lack of independence from NASA management. Those are violations of the quality standards for federal offices of Inspector General established under an executive order. The Integrity Committee said that discipline up to and including removal was appropriate. After receiving the report, the majority leadership of the Senate Subcommittee on Space, Aeronautics, and Related Sciences, Senator Nelson, as well as the chairman of the House Committee on Science and Technology, Mr. Gordon, and I, all called upon the President to remove Mr. Cobb as Inspector General of NASA. Mr. Cobb remains in office. The findings of abuse of authority by the PCIE involve Mr. Cobb's abusive and degrading treatment of his staff, resulting in massive staff turnover and affecting productivity. Mr. Cobb referred to his professional staff as burons, Mr. Cobb's shorthand for bureaucratic morons, and by other vulgar terms that I will not repeat here. Rather than dwell on the abusive atmosphere created by Mr. Cobb and its effect on productivity, I want to make sure that the second finding regarding the appearance of a lack of independence receives the attention that it requires. According to the official standards, Inspectors General and their staff, and I quote, have a responsibility to maintain independence so that opinions, conclusions, and recommendations will be impartial and will be viewed as impartial by knowledgeable third parties. Mr. Cobb has utterly failed to do that. Perception that Mr. Cobb lacked independence was set in motion during Mr. Cobb's hiring. Shortly after Sean O'Keefe moved from the Office of Management and Budget to NASA, Mr. O'Keefe, NASA's former administrator, decided that he didn't like the previous NASA Inspector General. He went to the White House and demanded a new one. How Mr. Cobb was selected is not entirely clear, but what is clear is that Mr. O'Keefe personally chose his new Inspector General and established a regime in which Mr. Cobb was part of Mr. O'Keefe's team and not the independent Inspector General required by law. As Mr. Cobb described it, Mr. O'Keefe reached a conclusion that I would be the perfect person to conduct the independent office of Inspector General activities. Once at NASA, Mr. Cobb called Mr. O'Keefe his boss and said he was afraid he would be fired if he displeased Mr. O'Keefe. And why shouldn't he think that, since Mr. O'Keefe had been able to fire the previous NASA Inspector General and pick the new one? According to some interviewed by the HUD IG staff who carried out the PCIE investigation, Mr. Cobb was warned from the beginning about lacking an appearance of independence. But he ignored those warnings, and the Integrity Committee's record of investigation is full of evidence of his failure to maintain any shred of an appearance of independence. Mr. Cobb asked NASA officials how to design the IG projects. A December 12, 2002 email, for instance, asked NASA officials to discuss two proposed projects so we can take your views into account in designing our activities. After the Columbia accident, there are questions about the independence of the O'Keefe-appointed Accident Investigation Board. Chairman Gordon was one of those asking questions. Mr. Cobb provided an unsolicited personal letter to Congress, unsolicited by Congress at least, saying that based on his observations, the board was independent. But before sending the letter to Congress, Mr. Cobb sent a draft to Mr. O'Keefe for his review and comment. Mr. O'Keefe liked the letter a lot. I could go on and on with more examples of the ways in which Mr. Cobb tried to make himself useful to his friends at the top of the agency, especially Mr. O'Keefe. But what is most important here is that Mr. Cobb is now totally ineffective in his job and trusted by no one. As he has made clear in his testimony today, his written testimony submitted in advance, Mr. Cobb has learned nothing from the PCIE investigation. He admits no wrong. He blames others for all of his problems. Mr. Cobb said in his deposition that if the current NASA administrator, Mike Griffin, invited him to go play golf, he would love to go. By all means, I'm going to go play if he asks. If he wants to invite me out to dinner, I think it would be perfectly appropriate for me to do so. He wants the same kind of relationship that he had with Mr. O'Keefe. Mr. Griffin, to his credit, apparently does not. Mr. Cobb, you must leave. You have two clients, NASA and Congress. That is clear from the statute, from the Inspector General Act of 1978. That is clear from the quality standards for federal offices of Inspector General, which I hope every Inspector General would keep on their desk. Congress is your client, one of only two. It is apparent that Congress does not trust you. The committees of the House and the Senate that are responsible for oversight of NASA are sitting before you. All of us have called upon the President to fire you. You have told our staff that you are afraid to talk to your own staff because they twist your words. So you are hiding from your own staff. As one of our witnesses said in written testimony, each IG must be willing to accept responsibility for his or her behavior and acknowledge when their independence has been compromised fairly or unfairly and exit office gracefully. Mr. Cobb, the work of the NASA IG is important. Mr. Cobb, you must leave to preserve what is left of the integrity of your office.
Senator Hutchinson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly am pleased to be here with our House colleagues for this joint hearing. I want to say that I have not called for Mr. Cobb's resignation because I haven't heard from Mr. Cobb. And I do think that regardless of how one feels about the allegations made against the NASA Inspector General or the process by which the allegations were investigated or the conclusions reached, the hearing certainly has been brought about because of a failure somewhere. The only thing that we can say is that the hearing is part of examination and accountability that can help us find where the problems exist within our jurisdictional areas of responsibility and how they can be addressed. I have made no prejudgment. I am, of course, I have to say, very concerned about the nature of the allegations made against the Inspector General of NASA. Some of them, if true, represent conduct that I find objectionable and should be changed. However, I also believe it is only fair that the oversight hearing include Mr. Cobb. I think that it is going to be very important to hear the allegations and then to allow him to respond. Most of all, I have to say that this subcommittee must ensure that nothing within the NASA institutional structure, including the Office of Inspector General, is allowed to have a negative effect on the ability of NASA to carry out its programs efficiently and safely. Those would be the primary concerns that I have. I have to apologize right now and say that I'm already late for a meeting that I cannot miss, so I will have to leave, but I will get all of the testimony of this hearing, and then we'll certainly be part of the collaboration about what should be done about it. And I appreciate, I've talked to Senator Nelson about the issue several times, and I appreciate that he postponed the hearing to try to make sure that we did have all the sides fairly represented, including Mr. Cobb. So thank you for that, and I will certainly look forward to our exercising our responsibility for oversight correctly. Thank you.
Congressman Feeney, standing in for Congressman Sensenbrenner.
Well, I'm not sure anybody can stand in for Congressman Sensenbrenner under any circumstances, but it's a pleasure to be here with my my senator, Mr. Chairman, and also my Chairman Miller and Chairman Gordon. I'll be very brief. I want to echo Senator Hutchinson's remarks that I have not prejudged this case. I'm interested in hearing from the witnesses, including the expert Dr. Light, as to the appropriate role of Inspector Generals, and look forward to hearing and reviewing the response from Mr. Cobb. With that, I would like to ask for permission to enter into the record an opening statement from Congressman Sensenbrenner.
So ordered. Now, as we have said, Senator Grassley had asked to be the first witness, and at precisely the time this committee kicked off, he was called to a meeting with the minority leader, and therefore he cannot be here. His lengthy statement will be entered into the record. but I would just read his concluding paragraph. And this is Senator Grassley. Quote, "So in conclusion, I have some questions that I would like to pose to Mr. Cobb. In answering them, I hope he honestly places the mission of his office ahead of his self-interest. Mr. Cobb, do you believe that an Inspector General can continue to serve if he has lost the confidence of his staff and of Congress? Do you believe an Inspector General can continue to serve who has been found by an independent investigation to have abused his authority? Do you believe an Inspector General can continue to serve if he is perceived as in the pockets of the people he is supposed to investigate? Do you believe an Inspector General can continue to serve if he has acknowledged verbally abusing staff on numerous occasions? These would be my questions to Mr. Cobb. The honest answering of those questions should lead him to make a decision as to what is best for NASA and the American people." End of quote. Likewise, Mr. Kenneth Donahue, the Inspector General of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, who conducted the factual investigation of the allegations against Mr. Cobb, is unable to be with us today. He has submitted his written testimony, and without objection, it will be entered into the record. And finally, a procedural note for all the witnesses. It is the custom of the House Subcommittee that is represented here today to require sworn testimony from witnesses in oversight hearings. This is not our practice in the Senate Commerce Committee. However, witnesses are reminded of their obligations under 18 U.S.C. 1001 to provide truthful testimony and the penalties for failing to do so. So with that, if we could ask the first panel to come up, please, to the witness table. The panel consists of Ms. Deborah Herzog, Senior Specialist, Office of Inspector General, U.S. Post Office, former Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Investigations at NASA. Mr. Kevin Carson, Assistant Inspector General for Audits, Office of the Inspector General, the Government Printing Office, former Assistant Inspector General for Audits in NASA. Mr. Lance Carrington, Deputy Assistant Inspector General of Investigations, Office of Inspector General, U.S. Postal Service. Former Assistant Inspector General for Investigations at NASA. Ms. Danielle Bryan, Executive Director, Project on Government Oversight. Dr. Paul Light, the Paulette Goddard Professor of Public Service, Robert Wagner School of Public Service at New York University. So welcome all. Mr. Carson, we will start with, let me just see, is that the order that you wanted? Mr. Carson, we will start with you. And all of your written statements will be entered into the record, and as you know, it was interpreted to you that we would like to have you give us a statement somewhere about 5 minutes in duration, and then we can get into the questions. Mr. Carson.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss my experiences while employed in the NASA Office of Inspector General. Since March 2005, I have been employed as the Assistant Inspector General for Audits and Inspections at the U.S. Government Printing Office, Office of Inspector General in Washington, D.C. Previously, I worked over 15 years between August 1989 and March 2005 for the NASA OIG. While with the NASA OIG, I held a variety of audit positions, including Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Audits, Director of Audit Quality, Program Director for Safety and Security Audits. Including my employment with the NASA OIG, I've spent approximately 27 years of my career in various federal audit organizations. I've been invited here today to provide testimony related to my time and experience in the NASA OIG while working under the direction of NASA Inspector General Robert Cobb. I request that my full statement be submitted for the record and will answer any questions related to its contents. In early 1999, the previous NASA Inspector General, Roberta Gross, upon the NASA administrator stating that the agency's #1 priority was safety, appointed me to form a directorate whose specific mission was to audit safety and security issues within NASA. While forming the directorate with a small staff of auditors, the director quickly performed a series of audits and issued reports addressing various safety issues, primarily at NASA's manned spaceflight centers. Among the first reports issued by the directorate included safety concerns with Kennedy Space Center's payload ground operations, contractor safety requirements at Kennedy Space Center and Marshall Space Flight Center, Space Shuttle Program Management Safety Observations, controls over the use of plastic films, foams, and adhesive tapes in and around the Space Shuttle orbiter vehicles, safety of lifting devices and equipment at Stennis Space Center. The report on safety of lifting devices and equipment at Stennis resulted from a request by the NASA Associate Administrator for Safety and Mission Assurance. The audit identified significant safety issues related to lifting devices and equipment and found that Stennis did not safely perform critical lifts of high-dollar items such as space hardware, one-of-a-kind test articles, major facility components, or personnel. In addition, we found that operators and riggers were not properly trained and certified. Operators used cranes with safety deficiencies, and crane maintenance and inspections were inadequate. At the request of the House Science Committee, we performed an audit of safety related to Kennedy Space Center's payload ground operations and found various materials used in processing facilities at the Kennedy Space Center consistently failed required tests for flammability resistance and electrostatic discharge. These potentially hazardous materials included plastic films, foams, adhesive tapes used by payload processing personnel under the center's payload ground operations contract. These materials had been used without approval of the Kennedy Safety Office since 1992. We also found that NASA had not identified, documented, and appropriately mitigated the risks of using these potentially hazardous materials, exposing personnel and flight hardware to increased risks. We also reviewed USA's controls over the plastic films, foams, and adhesive tapes used in and around orbiter vehicles and other segments of the space shuttle, such as the solid rocket boosters, main engines, and found similar problems. Each of the highlighted reports addressed potentially serious safety issues within NASA and within the manned spaceflight program. I believe that the success of the Safety and Security Directorate was directly attributable to the outstanding professionalism and work ethic of the managers and staff and their collective dedication to the NASA mission. It also helped that the Directorate's work was always supported by then Inspector General Roberta Gross. Although we issued some controversial reports that were not always accepted by the agency, I always felt that the Directorate had the complete support of senior OIG management, including Ms. Gross. On 2 occasions, in 1999 and 2001, the Directorate received the OIG Audit Report of the Year Award. One of these reports, related to contractor safety requirements, was transmitted by the NASA Administrator to every NASA Center Director, who was directed by the Administrator to implement the recommendations at their respective centers. In April 2002, Robert Cobb was appointed the NASA Inspector General. Although the Office of Audits initially continued to operate as previously, within 3 to 4 months there was a noticeable change. Specifically, there was considerably more involvement in writing, rewriting, and revising audit reports by the Inspector General. There was also considerable questioning of the audit results, with Mr. Cobb frequently not agreeing with the conclusions and recommendations in audit reports. There was also what I would say was a general disrespect shown by Mr. Cobb for auditors in particular. Mr. Cobb would often make comments like, anybody can perform an audit, or when an auditor would mention something like compliance with government audit standards, he would make the statement that the standards were only something for auditors to hide behind. He also, on more than one occasion, mentioned to me that the Safety Audit Directorate had produced nothing of value to the agency, that our audits were archaeological digs, or that we were too far in the weeds. It was also during this time period that Mr. Cobb appeared to be providing our reports to agency officials for review and comment prior to official draft release in order to determine whether the agency would agree with our findings and recommendations. On one such occasion, a proposed draft audit report on the International Space Station was provided to the NASA General Counsel to review prior to official release. The NASA General Counsel did not agree with a conclusion in the report related to the potential for NASA noncompliance with various international agreements on the ISS. Prior to the release of the report, the audit team was instructed to remove this section from the report or the report would not be issued. In instances like the previous one, if any of the senior audit managers were to disagree with Mr. Cobb or try to defend our conclusions and recommendations, we were subject to severe berating and profane language by Mr. Cobb. In January 2003, the Office of Audits was advised by Mr. Cobb that it would be merged with the Office of Inspections and that all senior management positions in the reorganized office would be moved to NASA headquarters so that there could be face-to-face accountability. Mr. Cobb frequently stated that he wanted these senior managers in Washington so that he could personally choke them. In February 2003, the Office of Audits was merged with the Office of Inspections into a new Office of Audits. As part of the reorganization, I was transferred to NASA headquarters and reverted to my former position as Director of Safety and Security Audits. It was made clear to me by both the new AIGA and his deputy that Mr. Cobb never expected any of the senior managers like me who were located at field centers to accept the transfer to headquarters. The new AIGA even mentioned that Mr. Cobb now had me where he could choke me. After arriving at headquarters in April 2003, I had even more contact with Mr. Cobb. It was also during this time that the Columbia accident occurred and the investigation of its cause had begun. As the Director of Safety and Security Audits, my directorate assumed a large role in directing the work of the OIG related to the recommendations of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, which published its final report in August 2003. In response to the CABE report, I compiled a plan to review the agency's implementation of most of the recommendations. In addition, I was authorized to hire additional technical staff to assist with the work to be performed. It was also during this period that Mr. Cobb began further interference with the work of the director through either constant rewriting of products or attacking the work of the staff and technical experts, to the point where findings and recommendations were either never officially issued to the agency or were issued unofficially by Mr. Cobb to various agency officials and thus never posted publicly to the NASA OIG website. I have provided examples of such issues in my prepared statement, including findings developed but never issued related to the organizational safety recommendations of the CABE and the failure of the backup command destruct system during a 2002 space shuttle launch. In response to these issues, Mr. Cobb made statements such as, "My staff had spent almost a year reviewing the independent technical authority and safety organizational recommendations of the CABE, yet had nothing to show for it," or with respect to the command destruct failure, that it was the Air Force's problem. There were numerous
Carson, I need you to wrap up.
In summary, by constantly writing and rewriting audit reports, not allowing audits of potentially controversial issues to be performed, or reports of completed audits to be publicly issued, constantly denigrating the audit staff in public and in private, intimidating auditors and staff through the use of verbal threats, foul language, and intimidating gestures, Mr. Cobb showed that he lacked independence from agency officials and was willing to go to any length not to issue audit reports that would embarrass the agency. In my opinion, he clearly created and endorsed a hostile work environment. Thank you, and I would be pleased to answer any questions.
Ms. Herzog?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committees. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to share my experiences as former Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Investigations under Inspector General Robert Cobb. I began my federal career 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, in 1983 as an Assistant U.S. Attorney. I served in U.S. Attorney's offices in such positions as Chief of the Narcotics Section, Regional Coordinator of the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, Public Corruption White-Collar Crime Chief, Chief of Major Investigations. I also served on details with the Department of Justice and with the United States Customs Service. In the 4 years before joining NASA, I was Senior Advisor to the Assistant Commissioner in the Office of Internal Affairs at the United States Customs Service. In November 2004, I was selected by Inspector General Robert Cobb as the Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Investigations at the NASA OIG. I served in that position until December of 2005 when I joined the U.S. Postal Service Office of Inspector General as a senior attorney. My testimony today summarizes my experiences and observations during my tenure at the Office of the Inspector General at NASA. During my pre-employment interview with Mr. Cobb, he expressed his unhappiness with management in the Office of Investigations, stating the investigators needed a grown-up to supervise. I accepted the position with the impression that Mr. Cobb wished to improve the quality of work at the NASA OIG and believed that I would be instrumental in that effort. One of my early experiences with Mr. Cobb was so disturbing that I considered leaving the OIG almost immediately afterwards. At a scheduled weekly meeting, Mr. Cobb, in front of his deputy and my supervisor, berated me concerning a word in a letter. In an ensuing monologue, loudly peppered with profanities, Mr. Cobb insulted and ridiculed me. After the meeting, I told Mr. Cobb one-on-one that I did not expect my superior to use profanity, that the use of profanity was unacceptable, and I would not tolerate profanity. Mr. Cobb listened and gave me no indication if he agreed or disagreed. In the months to come, however, I regularly observed and heard of Mr. Cobb using profanity to berate and demean employees. Mr. Cobb also exhibited a consistent lack of understanding of federal law enforcement. In 2 cases, approximately 6 months apart, Mr. Cobb was notified several hours before NASA OIG agents and FBI agents were to execute search warrants at NASA properties. Mr. Cobb said he would not allow the warrants to proceed before reading the affidavits, despite the fact that the responsible OIG supervisor had approved the warrants. The assistant United States attorney assigned to the case thought the warrants were fine, and the warrants were signed by a United States magistrate judge. After reading the warrants, Mr. Cobb's opinions included there was no probable cause, the assistant U.S. attorney was stupid, and the NASA agents must have hoodwinked the magistrate. Mr. Cobb was also overly concerned about the possible reaction of NASA senior management. Finally, after much discussion, Mr. Cobb reluctantly allowed the agents to execute the warrants. During my short tenure at NASA, at least 5 other warrants were issued and executed in locations other than NASA properties. Mr. Cobb did not express any interest in those affidavits or warrants. The incident that convinced me that I could no longer be effective in my job occurred in August 2005. Mr. Cobb directed a case accepted for civil prosecution by the United States Attorney's Office in the Central District of California be withdrawn pending a review of the investigation at OIG headquarters. In my 17 years as a federal prosecutor, I had never seen that done. Mr. Cobb claimed he was not aware that the case had even been presented to the U.S. Attorney's Office. However, a bi-weekly reporting document provided to Mr. Cobb in June proves otherwise. Subsequently, Mr. Cobb claimed that the NASA special agent in charge of the case, who wrote the withdrawal letter, was trying to set him up. The assistant U.S. attorney, however, had endorsed the work of the case agent, the case preparation, and the investigative report. Yet, in a subsequent meeting about the case, Mr. Cobb leaned over his desk, just feet from my face, his face red, his fists clenched, and screamed at the same time, slamming his hand down on the desk so hard that I jumped. "You know as well as I do that this report is a blanking piece of blank." In closing, Mr. Cobb's arrogance, bullying style, and questionable independence limit his ability to lead the NASA OIG, and in turn has demoralized the NASA workforce. As an example, a recently hired employee, after only 2 days at the NASA OIG, called the agency she left requesting her old job back because most of her staff spent a good portion of the workday looking for a way out. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Mr. Carrington.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committees, I appreciate the opportunity to appear today to share my experience as the former NASA Assistant Inspector General for Investigations.
Pull that microphone a little closer.
Yes, sir. My professional life is one of public service, starting with over 6 years of active duty in the United States Army and 12 years in the Army Reserve. I spent 17 years with the NASA Office of Inspector General, and the last 2 years with the Postal Service Office of Inspector General. In 25 years of public service, I have served as a federal law enforcement officer, manager, and executive. When I became the NASA OIG Assistant Inspector General for Investigations in September 2002, Mr. Cobb told me his expectations of my performance included being responsible for everything that happened in the Office of Investigations, and he further expected me to know every detail on every case at all times. We had over 400 open cases. It was an impossible expectation for anyone. Mr. Cobb complained that agents couldn't write, and he referred to their work as crap, regardless of case successes. He also referred to the agents as knuckle draggers. He would disparage agents in front of the rest of the office. To help mitigate Mr. Cobb's negative attitude about the agents, I personally reviewed and edited every investigative report or document that Mr. Cobb would see. I repeatedly asked Mr. Cobb what his expectations were and what we could do better. He always replied that he didn't know, but when he saw it, he would tell me. Other than Mr. Cobb telling me to keep him informed of anything and everything, he never told me what he wanted in 3 years I was there. Mr. Cobb became upset because the agents worked criminal and civil cases under the direction of the U.S. Attorney's Office. He would tell me and other senior managers that agents don't work for the U.S. Attorney, and for us to make sure the agents knew their boss was the IG. Mr. Cobb's personal interaction with the staff consisted of yelling and demeaning, and the more it affected them, the more he did it. In one instance, Mr. Cobb had asked an attorney for a legal opinion, but after he heard her opinion, he told her legal opinion didn't count, that his legal opinion was the only one that counted. He then proceeded to demean and ridicule her in front of the group. Mr. Cobb routinely used profanity when he spoke to me and other employees, stating F them and GD them. It was a regular occurrence that offended many people in the office. On one occasion, Ms. Deborah Herzog, my deputy, was trying to make a legal point with Mr. Cobb from her perspective as a former federal prosecutor. Mr. Cobb did not agree with her, so he leaned forward and yelled and cussed at her. As tears began welling in her eyes, I changed the subject so we could leave the room. At my performance review sessions, Mr. Cobb would say he wasn't happy. When I asked him for details, he would say that everything was wrong and I had better fix it. He never provided me with any specific examples. Once I showed Mr. Cobb a $3.94 million settlement check payable to NASA we had just received. Mr. Cobb's response was it didn't mean anything to him. I asked him why, and he said, and I quote, "Because I had nothing to do with it," close quote. I explained that it was representative of our office. He told me it didn't matter because he didn't have anything to do with it. Mr. Cobb appeared to have a lack of independence when NASA officials were the subjects of investigation. Warrant of arrest or search warrants were obtained for NASA facilities. Mr. Cobb would question every aspect of these cases, much more than the non-NASA subject cases. It gave us the appearance that he wanted to derail them before the agents were given adequate time to investigate the allegations. There were cases where search warrants were obtained for NASA offices and computers, but Mr. Cobb declared that there was no probable cause and he didn't want the NASA agents executing the warrants. I explained to Mr. Cobb that the cases were joint with the FBI and the searches would be executed anyway. He then allowed us to participate. Our Houston office was asked by the NASA Johnson Space Center legal office to assist the Texas Rangers with their ongoing investigation into an alleged missing ring, property of one of the female Columbia astronauts. The Rangers had exhausted all leads attempting to determine if the ring existed and whether it was stolen. As a last resort, the Rangers drafted a Crime Stoppers alert they planned to distribute to the media and as a courtesy asked the OIG to review it. I provided Mr. Cobb a copy of the draft alert. Mr. Cobb became very upset, lost his temper, and yelled and cussed at me, saying that if the media got a hold of it, he would have to resign. I reminded him that it was not our case and that we were merely assisting the Rangers at the request of NASA. Later that evening, Mr. Cobb called me at home and proceeded to yell and use profanities at me again. Mr. Cobb was so loud, I had to go into the garage so my family would not hear him. Mr. Cobb would not listen or try to understand it was the Rangers' decision. He continued to yell and use profanity, saying that he would have to resign if the alert was released. I didn't understand why Mr. Cobb was so upset about the alert until weeks later at an OIG senior staff meeting. Mr. Cobb mentioned the NASA administrator had previously ordered him and all NASA senior staff not to speak or do anything with the Columbia astronaut families. I then realized that if the OIG was associated with the Rangers Crime Stoppers alert, Mr. Cobb considered himself to be in direct violation of the order from the NASA administrator. Mr. Cobb told me he didn't like the special agent in charge at Goddard Space Flight Center and directed me to get rid of him. I asked Mr. Cobb why, because he was doing a good job. Mr. Cobb said he didn't want him around. I told the special agent in charge if he was offered an opportunity elsewhere, he should take it because Mr. Cobb did not want him around. About a month later, he left to take a job with the Transportation Security Administration. A short while after the special agent in charge departed, Mr. Cobb told me he wasn't happy with me. But this time he threatened me to make me the special agent in charge at Goddard. I asked Mr. Cobb for specific reasons, and he said he was just not happy. I told him I had done everything he had asked me to do. Mr. Cobb was never happy with anything we did in the Office of Investigations. I finally asked him if he even wanted us working cases. He told me no. I said if that was the situation, then he didn't need me around. He agreed. So I told him I would seek employment elsewhere. 2 weeks later, I gave him my 2 weeks' notice. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Dr. Light.
It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm not going to talk about this particular case. What I'd like to do is give you a little background on the expectations of Congress in enacting the 1978 Act regarding the kind of person they hoped would serve as Inspector General. I should note that Congress, in passing the 1978 Act, had many options for creating a much closer relationship between the Inspector General and the head of the establishment, be it a secretary or an administrator. Congress did not accept that alternative vision of the Inspector General, despite uniform opposition from the executive branch and from the President of the United States. Eventually worked toward an agreement to create a quasi-independent Inspector General in order to assure the kind of safe harbor, if you will, for investigations and auditing that we see in the statute now. In terms of expectations from the Inspector General in behavior and operations, I'm going to highlight 5 specific areas. The first is that Congress expected and demanded in statute that there be expertise in the Inspector General, that the individual appointed as Inspector General have specific skills that would allow him or her to effectively discharge their duties. The primary focus of this list of expertise was on auditing investigations, a set of skills that would allow the Inspector General to discharge his or her duties effectively. In reading through the legislative record and history of the statute and also the precedent set in the early appointments, we see that there is also an expectation that the Inspector General be a strong manager of the office. Congress understood that the offices of Inspectors General would be small, that they would have relatively meager resources in the grand scheme of things, and that they would have to be well managed to produce the highest level of productivity possible. Therefore, Congress expected that the individuals would be of the highest caliber possible, including expertise in management. They also expected, for a second characteristic, that the Inspector General be a leader who was a wise steward of the resources at his or her disposal. The offices of Inspectors General are fragile entities. They are not particularly popular within their agencies. It's not that individuals run from them, but it is rare that the Office of Inspector General employees are greeted with great friendship and glory when they enter to make their investigation or audit presence known. Number 3, Congress expected that the Inspectors General be assertive. The mandate in the statute is actually extremely broad in terms of what the Inspectors General are allowed to do. They are to inspect and audit and examine for the purpose of improving the economy and efficiency of government, not just piling up statistics about small caliber fraud, waste, and abuse. They're to reach towards the broadest agenda possible and maximize their impact through their activities, through the powers that they were given in the statute, which are significant. Number 4, the congressional designers expected maximum independence. This is, in fact, a lonely job. The individual who serves as Inspector General must on the one hand, have a strong relationship with the administrator, but it must be independent. Sad to say, there are very few ways in which the Inspector General can forge the kind of close friendships that we sometimes see envisioned without compromising the appearance and or substance of his or her behavior. And we have to be careful about that. You might wish to play golf with the administrator, but you create the appearance in doing so of a compromised freedom of investigation. And once that compromise occurs, you can never get it back. Number 5 expectation is integrity, that the individual who serves has an impeccable reputation, that he or she is the source of strong morale, a sense of esprit de corps within the office, and a strong commitment to the most effective operation possible. Through the exercise of independence, through the assertiveness in using the wide range of responsibilities embedded in the statute, this integrity becomes the essential coin of the realm in the IG's performance. I'd be delighted to talk with you further about these expectations and how we get them through the appointments process or not, and we'll look forward to receiving your questions. Thank you very much.
Ms. Bryan.
Chairman Nelson, Gordon, and Miller, thank you so much for inviting me to testify today. My name is Danielle Bryan, Executive Director of the Project on Government Oversight, or POGO. POGO is an independent nonprofit that has for 25 years investigated and exposed corruption and misconduct in order to achieve a more accountable federal government. The subject of this hearing raises a number of very timely issues. Inspector General offices play a tremendously important role in advancing good government practices, but only if they're led by independent and qualified IGs. Next year will be the 30th anniversary of the 1978 Inspector General Act. This is a perfect time to determine the strengths and possible weaknesses of the IG system, given the current investigations into several IGs. It is the independence from the agency the IG is overseeing that gives the office its credibility. Not only the actual independence, but also the appearance of independence allows the IG's stakeholders, including the administrator, Congress, the IG's auditors and investigators themselves, and potential whistleblowers, to have faith in the office. In this case, it appears Inspector General Robert Cobb no longer enjoys that credibility with any of the constituencies other than the administrator's office. Mr. Cobb disputes the basic facts in both cases that are focused on by the PCIE. However, even if one were to discount the two cases as inconclusive, there remains indisputable evidence that Mr. Cobb simply does not understand the need to, or even how, to remain at arm's length from NASA's administrator. For example, he defends himself in his testimony for today's hearing against these findings by incredibly citing NASA Administrator Michael Griffin's approval of his work as proof he should remain the NASA IG. That in itself indicates how insensitive Mr. Cobb is to the problem. In fact, Administrator Griffin should be the very last person he cites as evidence of his independence. Much has been made in the press of Mr. Cobb's golfing and lunches with former NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe, which are disturbing, but are really just atmospherics if they are by themselves the only instances of possible lack of independence. But what you see, given the testimony you've heard today and all the other pattern of behavior, is simply breathtaking. It's untenable that according to the PCIE report, that Mr. Cobb has conferred with NASA's Administrator and General Counsel on the scope and finding of his audits, that he has at least twice delayed the execution of search warrants, expressing concerns that NASA managers or of the staff or vendors who are the targets would be unhappy. He's even asked, are we going to be apologizing to them? In addition, while quantity does not equal quality, a reduction of nearly 50% in the number of reports, audit reports, means many topics are not receiving the attention they would have under past NASA IGs. One possible reason for this drop is the fact that Mr. Cobb disbanded the IG's safety audit team in the fall of 2005, only 2 years after the Columbia Space Shuttle tragedy. The PCIE report indicates, and we heard further testimony today to confirm this, that Mr. Cobb made it clear to his staff he didn't believe they had the technical know-how to challenge NASA's engineers, despite the fact that engineers were members of his staff. Given that the Columbia Accident Board concluded that NASA's safety culture has eroded, there may be no more important task for NASA's IG than safety audits to prevent future tragedies. A final example of Mr. Cobb's inability to protect the NASA IG office from the appearance of a lack of independence is the now infamous all-hands meeting of all IG staff held by Administrator Griffin. Not only should the head of an agency play no role in determining the work scope of the IG, but the fact that the IG himself did nothing to stop him is further evidence that Mr. Cobb clearly does not understand what it means to be an IG. I can only imagine the impact on the morale of the IG staff, and in particular on those whistleblowers who were sitting in the room. With this atmosphere, you can imagine the reception NASA whistleblowers met when they go to the IG for help. Now, as nearly half of the IG staff have left or removed from office, those whistleblowers, as well as staff leaving, have come forward to Senator Nelson and the PCIE, revealing the deeply troubled inner workings of their office and alleging that Mr. Cobb was turning a blind eye to the concerns of external whistleblowers as well as internal staff. Senator Nelson should be congratulated for stepping in to assist these insiders. So what should be done? The record reflects Mr. Cobb's overriding sense of loyalty to NASA's image above a sense of duty to the public and the Congress. POGO agrees with Chairman Nelson, Gordon, and Miller, as well as the PCIE, that Inspector General Cobb has clearly demonstrated an appearance of a lack of independence from NASA. It is because of this behavior that I believe Mr. Cobb is unable to fulfill his role as an Inspector General. An opportunity will be missed, however, if Congress does not look at this case in the broader context. During the Reagan administration, a small group of IGs from the PCIE recruited and screened IG nominees. They then supplied lists of candidates from which the White House could select. This peer review is an important way to ensure that unqualified or partisan people were not placed in the role of IG. The Congress should consider recreating that model. Ultimately, however, it is essential that Congress play a more active role in overseeing the IGs the way these two committees are doing today. POGO is also beginning an investigation into the IG system to determine if there are other ways to ensure these important offices can meet their mission, and we look forward to providing you with our findings when our investigation is complete.
Thank all of you for your testimony. The House has a vote in progress. I'm going to call, so we're going to be switching out here. I want to call on Chairman Gordon so that he can ask a couple of questions and then run to vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It'll only be one. Ms. Brain and Mr. Light, we appreciate you being here and your good testimony. I have one question for you. One of the facts that's clear from the sworn testimony taken during the investigation of Mr. Cobb is that Sean O'Keefe was allowed to make the decision to get rid of his old Inspector General and choose his new one. He also had two key staffers, including his Chief of Staff, brief Mr. Cobb on the problems between his office and the Inspector General's office that he wanted fixed. Mr. Cobb actually testified that he thought, and I quote, "Hey, this was easy. You don't need to convince me." Professor Light and Ms. Brain, is that the way a president should choose an Inspector General?
Certainly not. The entire purpose of the Inspector General is that they're supposed to be there both to oversee the agency on behalf of the Congress and to make the place honest and a more accountable place. And the fact that they're sort of hand-picked with those kinds of criteria is utterly unacceptable.
It was widely understood at the time that the decision to remove the incumbent Inspector General was driven by a desire for more compliance among a future Inspector General. The incumbent at that time was removed summarily from office, which sent a signal that the administrator was looking for somebody more compliant. That signal was well sent. Whether or not that signal was followed is a subject for this group to examine, this combination of committees to examine, but the way in which the outgoing IG was fired and the new IG was hired create in part a sense that this was all about getting somebody into the job who was compliant. and that starts the appearance ball rolling.
Mr. Chairman, I'll probably be leaving in a moment or two, but I don't have any pressing questions, but if it pleases the chairman, I'd be happy to ask one or two.
Please, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, and I really appreciate your hospitality as my senior senator. Mr. Carrington, one of the incidents that is referred to is the Texas Rangers investigation into a missing ring. In his testimony, his written testimony, Mr. Cobb suggests that after some investigation, it turns out that there was never a ring to be missing in the first place. Were you aware that, is that the case to your knowledge? Were you aware of this investigation about whether or not there was a ring that in fact was missing?
Yes, sir, I'm aware of it. The ring was never conclusively established to not exist. I mean, there were medical reports that determined, made an assumption that the item on the hand was not a ring. However, there were witnesses that gave sworn statements to the Rangers that reported that they found or they observed a ring on the hand. So it was never conclusive either way or the other. But again, it wasn't our investigation. We were assisting them with coordinating with NASA and assisting them with other matters. So I was never, I felt, based on what I had seen, I wasn't sure whether or not they did or did not have a ring.
So to this day, based on your review of the facts, you don't know whether there was a ring in the first place, one way or the other. Dr. Light, both you and Ms. Bryan have been very consistent in describing the appropriate role of the IGs and how they should be appointed and how they should conduct themselves. One thing that we haven't talked a lot about here is that in your testimony you indicate that the IG should be independent of influence, any influence from above, is the way Ms. Bryant talks about, but you also talk about independent of any pressure from the White House or, for that matter, from Congress. And I guess the question is, what's the appropriate role in Congress's oversight? Ms. Bryan suggests we need to be a lot stronger in overseeing all sorts of inspector general issues throughout the government. Is there a danger, in your opinion, that congressional oversight of IGs in and of itself, if it's overzealous, could put some inappropriate pressures on IGs in their role and, in essence, sacrifice their independence?
It depends on the nature of the investigation. An investigation of this nature, where you're examining the independence of the IG, can only reinforce and strengthen IG timber in making recommendations to you and the administration for action. There's intimidation of all kinds. If Congress were to bring an IG in front of a subcommittee or committee to berate that IG for undertaking an audit or investigation, that would have a chilling effect on the IG's independence. But I don't see a history of that having been done.
Thank you. And with that, I really appreciate the chairman's indulgence and, again, his hospitality. Thank you.
Sir, could I respond to the point you were making there? I just wanted to make the point.
Please.
Of course, if there were overzealous oversight, that would be a problem. I don't know that I was not suggesting overzealous oversight at all. And I do think it's important, as Dr. Light was suggesting, there's a big difference between oversight of the quality of the work of an office rather than trying to direct a particular finding by an IG, which I think, of course, would be totally inappropriate interference on the part of the Congress.
And I recall that one of you testified that you would think that some statutory change with regard to the initial selection, so that it's more of a selection based on merit as opposed to personal friendship, would be appropriate. That is your testimony.
That's right. That was the informal arrangement during the Reagan administration, and sometime, I think, in the early 90s, that fell out of practice, and I think that's something important for the Congress to reconsider.
There has been a proposal pending before the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee for a term of office for the inspectors general, which would be mainly hortatory. I think the 30-year anniversary is an opportunity for Congress to take a look at this concept and see whether we've gone too far in the appointments process, politicized it too much. What can we do to reverse it? So I encourage you to encourage your colleagues on that committee to engage that issue.
Ms. Herzog, you described two occasions when Mr. Cobb asked you to delay the service of a search warrant. Once in December of '04 regarding a case at Stennis, and again in June of '05 in a case at Marshall. Would you describe those two incidences?
Certainly. In the instance in December '04, I had just been at NASA for a matter of weeks, if not days, and was more of an observer than a participant until the discussion arose about whether or not there was probable cause contained in the warrant. I came into the situation at a time when Mr. Cobb had decided that the agents should hold off on executing the warrant. He read the affidavit, and even after reading the affidavit said, I don't think there's a crime here. At that point, based on my past experience, I have handled and litigated literally countless search warrants. I tried to explain to Mr. Cobb that an assistant U.S. attorney who is going to be responsible for the prosecution of the case and litigating the search warrant reviewed the warrant, seemed clearly was happy with the warrant, and a magistrate judge signed it. I mean, a magistrate judge found there was probable cause, and he asked his counsel whether or not he thought there was probable cause, and his counsel said, no, I don't think so. And with all due respect to his counsel, he's a very smart and learned man. He has never litigated a search warrant or prepared a criminal case in his life. It's kind of like asking an eye doctor to do heart surgery. I mean, I don't answer questions I don't know anything about. I believed at the time that I was the expert in the room on criminal process and procedure. I thought that's why I was hired, to deliver those skills to the office. And after a lot of conversation, Mr. Cobb finally allowed the agents to go ahead. It was embarrassing for the agents because they were conducting this investigation in concert with the FBI, and there they were, standing literally with a foot out the door ready to go execute the warrant, and they had to tell the FBI agents, our boss says we can't do this. The second instance was much more troubling. That search warrant came in several days before Mr. Cobb saw it. At the time that I finally had an opportunity to review it, he was out of town. I had not even quite finished reviewing the warrant when I got a call from the agent assigned to the case saying that the assistant U.S. attorney wanted to bring it to the magistrate right then. There was an issue of timeliness in that warrant because the fellow's office that was going to be searched was going to be changing jobs, and the agents wanted to get into the office before he started packing up boxes and perhaps destroying documents. I personally delivered a copy of the warrant and affidavit to the Deputy Inspector General, who was in town, and emailed a copy to both he and Mr. Cobb. Mr. Cobb was out of town and could not open the warrant on his BlackBerry because it was sent encrypted. He and his deputy apparently had a rather lengthy telephone conversation, and I was advised by his deputy to expect a phone call at home that evening. To call Mr. Cobb, which I did, and we had a rather contentious telephone conversation about whether or not there was probable cause for that warrant. In both cases, one of his concerns was, and it's almost a direct quote, what am I going to tell the center director when he asks me what our guys are doing down there? And my response is, how about our job? We're doing our job, and it's really none of their business what we're doing there. It's an enforcement activity. I asked if he was concerned that these guys, going in raid jackets and big guns. It was clear he didn't know how search warrants were executed when they were done on business premises, in offices. I said, these guys are going to be going in plain clothes, maybe even suits and ties, knocking on a door. Here we are. We've got a warrant to execute. Please remain outside while we do that. I mean, it was kind of, search warrant 101. The second instance, it appeared, in addition to Mr. Cobb's concern that, the agency might have trouble with the warrant. Well, what if he's innocent? Well, that happens. That's what happens in the criminal justice system. That's why we have all of the safety and the controls that we have over the system. It happens. Are we going to apologize to this man? Well, no, we don't do that. Do U.S. attorneys' offices apologize to people when they're acquitted? I don't think so. At one point, I said to Mr. Cobb, listen, this search warrant doesn't say you can do this if you want to, do this if you feel like it. It says you are commanded to execute this warrant. This is a court order.
Signed by a federal magistrate judge.
Signed by a federal magistrate judge, at which point he said to me, you're telling me that there is never an occasion when a warrant is not executed? And I said, absolutely not. I mean, there are times, I've been involved in cases, for example, when an informant has popped up at the last minute and the investigators have decided to stay covert. So they go and explain that to the magistrate. And they say, listen, we've decided to stay covert. We're not going to execute the warrant. Short of a situation like that, I'm not aware of an agency just, willy-nilly yanking a warrant. When I described that process, Mr. Cobb said, well, then I want you to call the assistant U.S. attorney and have the assistant U.S. attorney get that warrant pulled. He left the room to go into his office. I don't know for what. When he came back, he was off that topic, luckily for me, because that would have been my last act there. It was one of the most exhausting and painful conversations I have had in my professional life. It was just a horrifying exercise.
In your experience as a prosecutor or as in the office of an inspector general, whichever office, is it a practice that you've seen before on what you just described for management to delay the action on a search warrant after the warrant has been signed by a judge?
I have personally never known that to happen, other than the exceptions I've described.
Is it common practice for search warrants to require approval by the IG himself? Is that a common practice?
It's not a practice at the agency I currently work at, which is an inspector general's office. And I don't know whether it's a practice at other IGs. And up until these two instances, it was not a practice at the NASA inspector general's office.
Putting on your prosecutorial hat as an assistant USA, do you think that Mr. Cobb's actions could be construed as obstruction of justice?
I think, particularly with regard to the second warrant, but for my involvement in the case, the warrant would not have proceeded, and that would have been an obstruction of justice.
Did the delay in serving those warrants affect either of the cases being investigated?
It definitely did not affect the first case, and I do not believe it affected the second case, but I'm not sure.
Was there some question about someone was moving and packing up out of their office that search warrant, if delivered immediately, would have stopped before those records had been packed up?
Yes, well, because we don't know what, if anything else, was there 3 days earlier when the warrant should have been executed. We really don't know whether we lost anything. It's a possibility, but I don't think the agents ever determined whether or not they actually missed anything.
Do you have an opinion as to why Mr. Cobb wanted to block those search warrants?
I think primarily, he was primarily concerned with the reaction of the center directors at the centers where those warrants were to be executed. That was an overriding concern. He also, with the second warrant, believed that somehow this was an exercise wherein people were out to get him. They're rubbing this in my face, he said. They're doing this again to rub it in my face. And he thought that I delayed telling him about the search warrant for the same reason.
Chairman Miller, and then I will go to you, Senator McCaskill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The House is having 2 votes, and I believe that they will be the first 2. They're both procedural issues. I think they'll be the first 2 that I will have missed as Congress, but I wanted to stay here for this. I may need you to sign a note to my constituents, however. I do ask in unanimous consent to enter a packet of documents into the record.
Without objection.
Okay. They have been reviewed by both the majority and the minority staff. First, Ms. Herzog, Mr. Carson, Mr. Carrington, Mr. Cobb has said in his testimony that the HUD Inspector General invited anyone to come forward who had anything bad to say about Mr. Cobb. He complained bitterly about the procedures of the HUD Inspector General and the PCI report generally. Were you invited to come forward and make complaints, or did you step forward on your own?
I was contacted by the HUD OIG and mentioned that they wanted to interview me as part of that. My name had come up in several conversations with other people that had been interviewed, and they wanted to talk to me as part of the investigation.
Okay, Mr. Carrington, excuse me.
Yes. No, sir, I was not invited. I was contacted and asked to speak.
Okay. How about you, Ms. Herzog?
The HUD investigators contacted me.
Okay. Mr. Cobb also says that the staff was unhappy with him because he was insisting upon higher standards for the Office of the Inspector General. Do you agree with that? Do you agree that the standards set by Mr. Cobb were higher? Ms. Herzog?
No, I don't think they were higher at all, and I'm not sure what the standards were. In fact, whenever reports or documents were prepared and Mr. Cobb was unhappy with them, if any of us tried to get from him what it was he was looking for, what is it you want? His response was, I'll know it when I see it.
Okay. Mr. Carson, Mr. Carrington, did you think the standards in the OIG's office were higher under Mr. Cobb or lower under Mr. Cobb?
Having spent almost 16 years there, in a very the organization was very professional, very responsive to the concerns of the Congress when we had special requests. I believe the standards were lowered.
Okay.
Yes, sir. I think that I recall that he did have high standards. I won't doubt him there. But the standards, the bar was set so high it was impossible to reach, to the point where things didn't happen. I recall him saying, "I don't go into any type of issue without 4 aces in my hand." And so we were never going to reach the standard that he had set for me.
Okay. A lot of the testimony from the 3 of you in particular has been with going to the personal abusive relationship that Mr. Cobb had with his staff. There are people like that in the world. Some of them become bosses. Many people have worked for bosses who appear to go through life on full flame, as appears to be the case with Mr. Cobb, but are still able to get their work done. Was this different? Were you able to get your work done, or did his conduct interfere with getting the work done, and how? Ms. Herzog, you can start.
I think at least I was able to get my work done eventually. I did find those occurrences disturbing, and at times, particularly on the last occasion when he practically came across the table at me, I took the next day off of work. I mean, I was shaking when I walked out of his office. It was horrible. And I have to say, I've been yelled at by the best of them. I've appeared in federal court before judges who, lawyers like to commonly say, think they're the closest thing next to God. maybe other than Congress people.
We don't hold a candle to judges.
And you know, I've had my life threatened. I've been in protective custody. I've been stalked by a man that I've prosecuted. I have been under all kinds of stress and in stressful situations. I have never experienced anything like what I experienced when Mr. Cobb went on one of his, I'd hesitate to call them rampages, but.
Okay. I know my time is expected to expire, but Mr. Cobb apparently told the staff and told the HUD IG and has told our staff in preparing in looking into this matter that he wanted a collaborative relationship with the management of NASA, that he believed he would get the recommendations of the IG's office implemented. He'd be more likely to get them implemented if he had a cooperative, collaborative relationship, if he were part of the team. Was that, and that seems to be very much contrary to what Ms. Bryan and Dr. Light have said is what Congress intended in the Inspector General Act of 1978. But was it your experience that the recommendations of the IG's office got implemented more readily because of Mr. Cobb's good relationship with Mr. O'Keefe or others?
In my case, in the Safety Directorate, our reports were being rewritten, changed, revised, rewritten, changed, revised. The process was to the point of being insane. We couldn't even get recommendations or reports out the door that we had previously never had an issue with. As I mentioned in my statement, 2 times Report of the Year, special request from the Safety and Mission Assurance Associate Administrator, from this committee, for the House Science Committee, and we couldn't even get reports out the door.
Okay. Mr. Carrington?
Ours was a little different, and I used a different process when getting reports out. The IG Act required us to notify the Department of Justice, the Attorney General. So when allegations came in, we immediately started working with them and in joint cases with the FBI. And so our cases took a little different, our reports took a little different road. So anything that did come through, you know, it was very difficult to get the report out in any possible time frame.
Ms. Herzog? Herzog?
I, for most of the time I was there, worked for Mr. Carrington, and at the time he left and I was acting, I tried to implement some procedures that made it a little easier, and they actually ended up overcomplicating things because they were not quite accepted at face value. I really don't have an answer to that question.
Okay. Just one more. Mr. Carson, in your testimony before the HUD IG, you described the relationship of Mr. Cobb, Mr. O'Keefe, and Mr. Pasterik.
Yes.
That, as the Holy Trinity. What was the origin of that phrase? Was that your phrase?
No, it wasn't my phrase. It was a phrase that I had heard used by various officials and employees in NASA headquarters that referred to those three as the Holy Trinity. No, I did not originate that. That was just something I had heard numerous times.
What did it mean?
It meant that basically everything in the agency went through those three individuals.
Okay.
That, you know, it was inferred that they ran the agency.
Ms. Herzog, did you hear that phrase, and what did you understand it to mean?
Well, I never actually quite knew what the Holy Trinity was. I'm Jewish.
Okay.
Which wasn't in my repertoire, but I did understand that it meant, I believed it meant the people in power and aligned in power.
Okay. Mr. Carrington.
Yes. I'm Catholic, so
You know very well what it means.
I know what it means. And it was I had heard the reference before, and it was not by our people at the IG's office. I heard it from NASA employees. I had a large source network of NASA employees, and they would refer to the group, the three, as the Holy Trinity because they had such a close relationship that if one said something, the other one would know immediately.
Okay. Mr. Carrington, you mentioned frequently working with the FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office as part of your role in the IG's office. Did the assistant U.S. attorneys that you were working with come to different conclusions about the same information in the course of those investigations?
Different conclusions than the Inspector General, than Mr. Cobb?
Right.
Yes. Mr. Cobb has a lot of experience in the area of conflict of interest and ethics from his background, and so he knows that pretty well, and probably better than a lot of prosecutors, because those cases don't really get prosecuted that often. And I recall one instance in Norfolk down there where Mr. Cobb actually felt that there was a violation, a technical violation, and the U.S. Attorney's Office didn't agree with him, and because they were looking at it from a prosecutor perspective. So in that instance, there was disagreements. He on other areas where he didn't have that background or expertise, he didn't see things the same way as the prosecutor. So there were a lot of differences, and in some instances he would say, get him on the phone, let me talk to him right now. And which, my experience with IGs is not a normal thing that happens.
Did he ever say he could or did go over their heads?
Yes, sir. He in particular, the one in Norfolk, he told the senior prosecutor there, the supervisor, that he could go over his head. He could go to the U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia. And the prosecutor said, yes, you can. And what's going to happen is the U.S. Attorney is going to call me, and I'm going to tell him the same thing, and that's going to be the end of it.
How about to Mr. Gonzalez? Did he ever say he could call Alberto Gonzalez?
He would just make references that I recall that he had worked for Mr. Gonzalez, and that Mr. Gonzalez was a friend of his, and that he could call, go all the way to the top in the Department of Justice.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator McCaskill is the former elected auditor of the state of Missouri. Senator McCaskill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing today. I just don't know where to start. I spent all my adult life as either a prosecutor or an auditor, and I understand the difference between the two roles. It doesn't appear to me that Mr. Cobb understood the difference between the two roles, and that an auditor's job, I just can't fathom an auditor second-guessing a court order search warrant. You cooperate with law enforcement. Your job is to provide them information. Your job is never to try to second-guess professional law enforcement work. I want to, in the time I have with this panel, there are so many questions I would like to ask all of you, but I'd like to focus for a minute on Mr. Carson. You remind me of some of the career auditors that I was fortunate enough to encounter when I took the job as state auditor. You've been 27 years you've been doing this under a variety of different administrations, and I'm willing to bet, knowing auditors like I know auditors, that you saw your job as your job, regardless of who was in charge in Washington at that given moment in time. I want to congratulate you on the work you did as it related to safety. I can imagine no higher calling as an auditor than to be tasked with the responsibility of safety audits as it relates to the NASA program. I have such respect for the chairman because of the work he's done in this area, and the heart of this nation breaks when we lose people in the NASA program because of safety issues. And so I congratulate you on that work, and I would like to specifically ask you that in your testimony, and I'm sorry I missed it, I was on the floor on the immigration bill, but you quote several times some things, and I'm curious if these are your recollections or if you took notes as it related to some of the things that Mr. Cobb said to you relating to his refusal to issue audit reports that you had done in this important area.
Personal notes, I had notes, but when I left NASA, I basically left everything in my office. I wasn't about to take anything out of there except for some copies of documents that, I thought may come in handy one day. The work paper files for these audits, I believe the staff, my staff, papered the files with reports that weren't issued, review comments, information like that that would support everything I've said as far as not issuing reports. Now, some of the comments, no, they're just things I'll never forget.
Well, obviously, anybody can perform an audit is one that would stick in my mind.
Right, and that was a common statement, and
Something for auditors, I mean, calling the yellow book something that auditors can hide behind
right,
is jaw-dropping from an IG.
and we were.
I mean, that in and of itself is absolutely, completely incomprehensible that an IG in the United States government would call the yellow book something for auditors to hide behind. Are you confident that that is what he said, Mr. Carson?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And him saying that your safety audits had produced nothing of value to the agency? I look forward to reviewing those audits in detail. I have not, and one of the frustrating things for auditors is when they do good work is worrying if anybody ever reads the whole thing. And I know you all relate to that. If you would for a minute, and you may have covered this in your testimony, but I'm particularly concerned by his unilateral decision to not issue audit product. That is a huge decision for the head of an audit agency to make. First of all, it wastes taxpayer dollars, because when the audit work has been done, the taxpayers have spent a lot of money. So if, in fact, there is some reason for an audit report not to be issued, there should be some documentation of that by the head of that audit agency as to why that audit was not issued. Were you ever given, or to your knowledge, did Mr. Cobb ever prepare a written document that would lay out why an audit report that had been completed was not issued by your agency?
No, but there would be evidence in the working paper files of what, like in my written testimony, I talked about audit reports that became emails or unofficial emails to NASA officials late at night. We do have that. But no, never any written reason why. That's why in my testimony, when I talk about a year into the review of the organizational recommendations of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, my staff had written 3 reports addressing the way NASA was going about implementing straight line safety and mission assurance, straight line funding, and independent technical engineering authority. And I go to a monthly directorate update with Mr. Cobb, and he says to me, "You've worked on this for over a year and you've got nothing to show for it." And I'm sorry, but at that point I had to defend the work done by my staff, and I said we've written 3 different reports making recommendations about that, and they were never issued.
And let me also follow up on that, because I understand from your testimony that you believe, or you have knowledge, that he was calling the administrators of your agency prior to a draft of the report? So this wasn't a review of a draft, but that he was checking in with the top management of the agency?
It was the general counsel, yes.
With the general counsel?
Yes.
In your 27 years of working as an auditor, have you ever known of the head of an audit agency to call the auditee with feedback prior to a draft of the audit?
No, absolutely not.
I mean, that is a violation of Yellow Book standards, isn't it? Government auditing standards?
Well, it's definitely a violation of the independence standard, I would say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Was there ever any attempt on the part of Mr. Cobb to understand that he should be subjected to the Yellow Book standards? That he was part of an audit organization? Did he understand that in his role as heading this, that he was in fact an auditor himself?
Early on, we did try to, and I know my boss at the time did try to bring up, in our senior staff meetings on the audit side, he would talk about expressing concern about Yellow Book and professional audit standards. And, it was relayed to all the managers in the organization that that we use that as a crutch to hide behind.
Dr. I know I'm out of time, Senator, and Dr. Light, is there anything specific that exempts IGs from Yellow Book? And for people who don't, the Yellow Book is in fact like the Code of Professional Responsibility for government auditors. Is there anything that exempts IGs from having to respect the provisions of the Yellow Book standards of government auditing?
Nothing whatsoever.
And is there anything that specifically directs them to be subject to the Yellow Book standards of professional government auditing?
The highest professionalism possible. It's embedded in and implied in the statement of qualifications in the IG Act itself. I don't think Congress felt at the time that it had to say abide by the Yellow Book.
Right.
That's just, beyond required.
Kind of like brushing your teeth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sun will come up in the morning.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Light, in Exhibit number 2, which is the Integrity Committee's finding with respect to the abuse of authority, what effect does such conduct have on the effectiveness of an Inspector General?
I've been thinking about this as we've been going through this conversation today. The most powerful product of an IG and the OIG is the deterrence effect of their work. That's where the independence and the integrity really works its will, so that people understand that there is an independent place to go, a safe harbor for whistleblowers, and that there is a consequence for malfeasance and misfeasance. This is where this kind of behavior would have had its most pernicious impact in reducing the sense among NASA employees and contractors, and you have to decide what that exposure is in terms of risk, their sense that they would be held accountable for what they did or did not do. I think that's where the effect is most pronounced.
Mr. Carson, I have a series of questions for you. On the space shuttle, there is a destruct system that is redundant, so there are two. And it is the awesome responsibility of an Air Force officer at the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station that should that space shuttle go off of its intended trajectory and start headed to a populated area, such as very nearby Cocoa Beach or Titusville, Daytona Beach, that safety officer has the responsibility of destructing. The launch criteria is both the primary and the backup have to be working. That's the launch criteria. Now, you handled an investigation into the status of the range safety systems during the June 5/02 launch of the Space Shuttle. What did your inquiry determine?
Senator, I received it was actually a referral. The Air Force had looked into it and then had referred it to the NASA OIG, our Office of Investigations. And it was a potpourri of issues about the command destruct system, the procurement of the command destruct system, but they referred it over to us after closing it out. They gave it to our Office of Investigations, who determined there was no criminal activity. And Lance, Mr. Carrington's group, referred it to me as a safety issue because of the command destruct system was non-operational. I had an Air Force officer assigned to my safety group who had been an investigator on the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, came to work for me after the board had released its final report and spent the 2-year detail. We got the referral in 2004, and the officer who worked for me started doing some interviews, investigating down at the Cape. Myself and him went down in January of 2005. We met with NASA, determined that everything we heard, that the mission flight control officer and the chief of safety for the Air Force were both no-go for that launch and were overruled by the range commander.
that was as a result of a 2-year investigation, and that's what the report stated.
No, the 2-year, no, we only had it for a couple, we got it 2 years after, NASA OIG got involved with it 2 years after the actual incident itself. But nothing had been done apparently to that point. The Air Force gave it to us and said, you may want to look at the launch safety issues.
Okay, so what happened?
We investigated, myself and the Air Force officer working for me went down to the Cape in January 2005. We met with NASA safety officials. Everyone we talked to, it was unprecedented that a chief of safety and a mission flight control officer were no-go for launch, but were overruled. So we talked to the NASA folks. NASA folks had a representative in the range. The NASA firing room and the range are two different facilities. NASA had a safety official, knew something was going on, but never communicated to the launch control center that there was an issue with the command destruct system on the range. When the final poll came around, the range commander said they were go for launch, overruling the two safety officials, and the launch took place with a non-operational backup command destruct system. We came back, we met with NASA officials, we told them what the issue was. They agreed. We said we were going to make a recommendation that NASA put a safety official on the communication link in the Range Operations Control Center. That was going to be our recommendation. We came back. NASA was in complete agreement with us, the safety folks down at Kennedy. We came back in February of 2005. We briefed Mr. Cobb, and at that meeting he said, let the Air Force handle it.
So at the end of the day, did NASA's Office of the Inspector General release any report on the findings to NASA management?
Senator, I left NASA about 3 weeks later, and to my knowledge, I have never seen anything related to that issue.
Did your organization conduct an audit of NASA's compliance with the recommendations of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board report?
Yes, we did. We conducted a number of audits and inspections related to all the recommendations in the Columbia accident report.
And what was the ultimate disposition of that case?
I left NASA before the final report was ever issued, if there was a final report ever issued.
So we don't know if the findings that NASA was not, you do not have personal knowledge that NASA was not implementing the Columbia Accident Investigation Board's recommendations?
No, I don't.
Okay. Let me flip it to you, Chairman Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Nelson. Senator McCaskill asked about Yellow Book standards, which I'm not sure the average person would know anything about, but Senator McCaskill, based on her professional background, knows very well and is shocked by the deviation, the flagrant deviation from those standards, and asked if the standards for the Inspector General were different from those standards expected of auditors generally. Are any of you familiar with equality standards for federal offices of Inspector General, which I held up before in the opening statement?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And these standards are issued pursuant to an executive order to provide professional standards, standards of conduct for an Inspector General. Is that correct? The statute itself has the purpose of establishing independent and objective units within each agency, the Inspector General's office. These standards say that objectivity imposes an obligation to be impartial, intellectually honest, and free of conflicts of interest. Independence is a critical element of objectivity. Without independence, both in fact and in appearance, objectivity is impaired. Is that your understanding, all of you, of the obligations of an Inspector General?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Under the provision on independence, again, it says that the opinions, conclusions, judgments, and recommendations of an Inspector General should be impartial and be viewed as impartial by knowledgeable third parties. And then it discusses impairments, what may detract from the independence, both actual and apparent. And it says that personal impairments of staff members result from relationships and beliefs that cause OIG staff members to limit the extent of an inquiry, limit disclosure, or weaken or slant their work in any way. OIG staff are responsible for notifying the appropriate officials within their organization if they have any personal impairments to independence. Now, we've heard testimony from the three of you with respect to this particular case. We've got a voluminous record from the IG of HUD. We've had staff interviews, and what we understand is that Mr. Cobb met or played golf frequently with the NASA Administrator, Sean O'Keefe, met him in his office for drinks, went to lunch with him on a weekly basis, frequently in the cafeteria of the NASA cafeteria, so other employees saw them there, the three of them, Mr. O'Keefe, Mr. Pastrick, and Mr. Cobb, and that he sent audits, reports to Mr. O'Keefe and others for their review before issuing them, and changed things that they didn't like. In the view of any of you, does that meet the requirement of personal of independence? Is that a personal impairment? Ms. Bryan?
Yes, it certainly is an impairment.
Does it violate these standards in your judgment?
I don't think there's any question that it does.
Dr. Light?
Same answer. It is an impairment, and it violates those standards.
The standards of professional conduct.
Right.
And these are issued by, the PCIE includes all the inspectors general themselves. So this is the view of inspector generals of what their professional obligations are. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, on one level it seems so small, lunch at the cafeteria, or maybe the administrator gives the IG a couple of mulligans on the golf course, whatever. It seems so small. But the appearance effect in the agency as a whole, to whistleblowers and others, that there may be some sort of clear relationship between the agenda for auditing and investigation and the personal relationship, is enough to destroy the integrity of the office in terms of its creating the deterrent effect that it aims to create.
Ms. Bryan, you're shaking your head.
No, and I'm just thinking that certainly in the context of all the other activities of checking with them, if the staff are aware that he's checking with them on the scope of what audits should be even before they're begun. I mean, those kinds of things are just unimaginable to professional staff at IGs.
Okay. To the ordinary person without a professional background, there probably is a sense of what's the problem with going to play golf with someone? What's the problem with meeting someone from work for drinks? What's the problem with going to dinner with someone or lunch with someone from work? But that's not the expectation of the Inspector General.
That's correct. And as I said in my testimony, those are sort of atmospherics. At one level, if that were the only thing happening, I think the golf may not have happened all that often, I think a couple of times. But if that's all that had happened, that may not merit the kind of concern that the Congress has at this point. But when you put it in the context of all the other activities, that's when I think it becomes overwhelming.
One IG once described this job as being like straddling a barbed wire fence. It's extremely difficult to do, and it does impose on the auditor or the IGs, an isolation. A posture that is not comfortable at all in one's day-to-day work, but that requires a courage and perseverance that goes beyond sort of the personal gratifications of socializing and so forth. You just have to keep that in mind as you look at these things as the effect on the professionalism of the staff.
Okay, and the description that Mr. Cobb made of wanting to have a good relationship, wanting to ingratiate himself with Mr. O'Keefe so that he could get his recommendations accepted and implemented. Is that consistent with these standards and your understanding of what the professional obligations of an Inspector General are?
It is the IG's ultimate goal to see the recommendations of audits and investigations turned into action. That does not require ingratiation. That requires respect and integrity among all parties. One of the people we're not talking about at depth here is the administrator and what he sought to accomplish through this relationship. We haven't talked about the Deputy Director of OMB for Management, who has a role government-wide to protect the Inspectors General from undue influence. So, you know, there is a desire to have your recommendations adopted, and you want to have a good professional relationship with the leadership team, but under no circumstances do you give away your independence. Your recommendations are adopted because they're the right thing to do, not because you're friends or pals with the administrator.
Okay.
Yes, I would concur. I mean, basically, you get your recommendations implemented because of the strength, the power of the information that you have and the respect you have for it, not because of your friendship.
In these standards, there's also a discussion of external impairments. External impairments to independence occur when the OIG staff is deterred from acting objectively and exercising professional skepticism by pressures, actual or perceived, from management and employees of the reviewed entity or oversight organizations. Impairments include external interference or influence that could improperly or imprudently limit or modify the scope of OIG work, or threaten to do so, including pressure to reduce inappropriately the extent of work performed in order to reduce costs or fees. Again, asking the management what they want to investigate, running drafts by them before publishing drafts, editing it based upon their concerns, is that an external impairment?
There's no doubt. And the fact that even after the Congress has begun its investigation, to allow the administrator to come in and speak to the entire IG staff, and during that conversation, minimize the findings of the PCIE, which is problematic in itself, but then start to tell them what he thinks they should do, including only doing investigations that involve $1 billion of savings, with the IG sitting there and allowing it, to me, is absolute evidence that he simply doesn't really understand the problem at all.
Okay, that was actually my next question, but that's okay. Dr. Light, would you agree with Ms. Bryan's?
I think we're in close agreement on pretty much everything here.
Okay. With respect both to asking in advance, exchanging emails, chatting emails about...
You develop your agenda for the office from conversation and from observation. It's not, unacceptable to talk to the administrator about what you intend to do and to have the administrator say to you, well, I'd sure like you to focus on X or Y, but at no point does the IG give the control of the agenda to someone other than him or herself. That is just not acceptable. It's a bright line. So can you have a conversation with the administrator about what you're going to do, where things are going? That's fine. Can you use that information to circumscribe or to somehow curtail your activities? Absolutely not. You have to follow the statute's direction, which is extremely broad, broader than many people recognize in its intent.
And I don't think you've spoken directly to the mandatory meeting, as Ms. Bryan did, of the staff of the OIG, the Office of the Inspector General in NASA, with Mr. Griffin, in which he addressed the PCIE report with respect to Mr. Cobb and basically said, Moose is my boy.
That is a meeting that should never have occurred, in my judgment. It reflects a lack of understanding somewhere about the nature of the relationship between the administrator and the Office of Inspector General. Should never have happened. Tremendous chilling effect on the independence of the OIG.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator McCaskill.
I unfortunately am going to have to, I got the short straw to preside over the Armed Services hearing at 4:30, so I'm going to have to leave to do that in just a few minutes. I will not be here for the next witness's testimony, but I do want to speak to the auditors on the panel a little bit about the nature of audit reports in terms of how conservative they are. And I noticed that Mr. Cobb in his testimony wants to diminish the fact that this report that was issued by the HUD-IG by the President's Council on Integrity and Efficiency. Could you speak briefly about the requirements for every finding in an audit to be referenced and how strict the requirements are in government auditing in terms of nothing is put in a report that cannot be documented by direct reference? And that's when you refer to your work papers, obviously that's the guts of an audit that is used to glean the information that is reviewed and reviewed and reviewed for references. You know, it shows his testimony about this report and the fact that it didn't show any illegality. And, you know, this is a bruising report since this is a peer review in essence. Am I correct that for Mr. Cobb, the Integrity Committee's report is his peers passing judgment on his ability to do this job? And could any of you reference the conservative nature of you guys? You know, it is, you know, in my experience, it's very hard to ever question an audit because of your training and the way you view what you do in terms of the documentation.
Well, just to speak for audits, not investigations, but for audits, like you mentioned, I mean, we have a very thorough, every organization I've ever belonged to, we have a very thorough what we call referencing process where an audit report is referenced back to supporting work, supporting documents, interviews, what have you. And then a third party not even associated with the audit will usually come in and do what we call an independent referencing, checking the facts and figures in every report. Someone who wasn't even involved with the job.
Clean read.
Yes, ma'am.
And when he took some of these reports and wanted to change findings, wanted you to change findings, did you explain to him about referencing and that this was not a matter of him waving a magic wand and the audit report changing, that every finding has to be referenced? Did he understand that concept?
The auditors, the management team, we argued those things constantly, but towards the end, I mean, it shows by the number of people that have left, we just refused to go along with it at some point. Yeah, I mean, we only tried to publish what we could support. I can't say we published anything that wasn't supportable, but mostly it was things being taken out of reports.
How many auditors have left NASA OIG since Mr. Cobb has taken over?
I have no idea, but it's quite a few. All I know is the entire senior management team that I worked with upon his arrival, of probably 15 to 17 senior auditors, there may be one left.
And what about the number of audits that have been performed? Now, and I realize that in a couple of instances, he took audits and made them emails to management, or he took an audit and changed it into a letter. And so there was never any public document issued.
Right.
That the public would know that he was doing his job as an independent IG on these operations. I mean, how many times did that occur, and what about the product in terms of the number of audits that were issued under his tenure?
Senator McCaskill, if you'll look at that chart, and if you all will put that chart up on the easel, you'll see the number of audits in the terms of the two previous IGs in NASA.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And was this a result, I mean, did you have a severe staff shortage that occurred under Mr. Cobb that would have accounted for this kind of reduction in the number of audits?
Not at all. I can attribute it to, I think we were doing just as much work, but the reporting process was so, the process was there was no process. We couldn't get anything out. It was more painful to the audit teams to try to issue a report than to just look the other way at issues. That's how bad it got towards the end.
So it was easier to start another audit, even though I'm sure it took a lot longer under Mr. Cobb to complete audits. It was easier just to not fight it and go on? I mean,
well, or not.
Fewer starts.
You know.
Did he approve the starts? Did he approve the initial starts?
Some, yes. I mean, we were talking earlier about planning and the influence of the agency over planning. I mean, there were several. I had security as a responsibility also. And after 9/11, the agency received quite a large appropriation for security, supplemental security funding. And that was my #1 security priority audit, and I was never allowed to start. And I had allegations from sources throughout the agency that some of that money may have been misspent, and I was never allowed to start that audit.
I noticed also in his testimony, and I've got to get this in now because I have to leave, I found a certain irony, Mr. Chairman, that Mr. Cobb, in one instance, defended himself by saying that he had done something better than the Department of Justice, which is a little ironic in light of the current situation that we have at the Department of Justice. I thought that was an interesting defense of his behavior, that he would draw that comparison. And I've got to say, before I leave, and thank you to all of you for being here, I don't know why we're here, because it's obvious to me that this Inspector General doesn't get it. And it seems to me that his resignation should have occurred a long time ago. And the fact that he hasn't resigned is an insult, I believe, to Inspector Generals throughout government that are doing their jobs with independence and integrity and courage, and to all the auditors that are out there working in the federal government, doing the best they can to hold our government accountable. Your job is not to make the people you work for look good. Your job is to reassure the taxpayers that we're doing our best. And clearly this is an Inspector General that doesn't understand that obligation. And to me, it is a vaulted and honorable obligation that one should relish and embrace. And I want to go on record as saying I believe that if Mr. Cobb does not resign immediately, that I certainly hope that other senators will join me in recommending that he be removed from his position. And I thank all of you for being here today.
Thank you, Senator McCaskill. And if your Armed Services meeting concludes, if you would come back, your expertise is certainly valuable and has lended great credibility to the questioning today from the depth of your experience as a prosecutor and as an auditor. I just wanted to, Dr. Light, clear up just a couple of little loose threads here, and then if Chairman Miller doesn't have any more questions, we'll proceed.
I don't know this panel, but a vote has just been called in the House that is one I can't explain missing back home. In fact, it has to do particularly with North Carolina. And it's a bill that I've co-sponsored in 3 Congresses now, and it's going to a vote for the first time. So I really do need to go vote on that, but I will be right back.
Okay. All right, Dr. Light.
You haven't been called yet. It'll be called shortly.
Okay. In this case, the head of the PCIE elected to send the Integrity Committee's findings to the NASA administrator, which we've already discussed, for him to take corrective action. Where, in a case like this, where the independence of the IG is at issue, how much sense does it make that the agency's management would decide his punishment?
I think the findings should go to the Deputy Director for Management of the Office of Management and Budget. However, in this particular case, there is a conflict of interest in that the current Deputy Director for Management was the Director of the Office of Presidential Personnel, which selected the Inspector General for appointment. Therefore, you would move this up a notch, and the findings would go to the Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget. And that's where it should reside, and then be discussed in the councils of the White House to decide what to do with this particular appointee, but not to the head of NASA, I'm afraid.
At NASA, the ultimate disposition of the Cobb case was determined after a review by NASA's General Counsel. And it admits, the General Counsel admits in some of the testimony that these committees have received, to a sort of mentoring relationship with Mr. Cobb, and that he had discussed the investigation with Mr. Cobb at weekly intervals throughout. How credible is the NASA General Counsel's review and recommendations in this case?
Well, I don't think they're particularly credible, are they? You have the substance of the argument in the case, as I understand it through brief exposure, that the IG has been compromised due to his relationships with the administrator and senior leadership team, of which he is a part and wants to be a part, wants to ingratiate himself, and you would not have your general counsel involved in that conversation. The instinct of the administrators and general counsels all across government are to some extent not to have a strong inspector general. It's an uncomfortable thing to have in your midst, and you would not look to them to make the decision on whether a friendly inspector general would stay in office or not.
Any further questions? Well, thank you, Ms. Herzog, Ms. Carson, Mr. Carrington, Ms. Bryan, Dr. Light. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
The first panel we will dismiss, and we will call up Mr. Cobb.
And Chairman Nelson, I misunderstood. I will probably have a vote in about half an hour, but when I get called, I will have to go to that.
Okay. All right. Jane, who are the two guys, three guys standing? The fellow sitting next to him is his personal plan. Mr. Cobb, your written statement has been received. It is a part of the official record, and we would like for you to summarize it for us, and then we will have some questions. You may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Robert Cobb. I am the Inspector General at NASA. Today, I respond to unjustified allegations against me as reported by the Integrity Committee. The Integrity Committee found that I did not break any laws or act illegally.
Pull it a little closer.
Turning it on is helpful also. Thank you. The Integrity Committee found that I did not break any laws or act illegally. Moreover, the Integrity Committee did not suggest that any matter covered in the wide-ranging investigation was mishandled by the NASA OIG. However, the Integrity Committee did reach certain other conclusions which are demonstrably invalid. Anyone seeking to learn the truth about the Integrity Committee's findings should examine my written statement, which makes clear that the findings are a travesty. Failing to find actual lack of independence, the Integrity Committee asserts an appearance of lack of independence in specifically 2 instances, one involving a proposed Crime Stoppers notice and the other relating to the investigation by my office into the illegal copying of international traffic in arms regulation designated materials. I prove in my written statement that these assertions are utterly devoid of merit. As regards independence, the Inspector General Act, its legislative history, and PCIe guidance mandate a good working relationship between an Inspector General and the agency head. The Inspector General Act states that the Inspector General is, quote, to report to and be under the general supervision of the agency head, end quote. The agency head under the Inspector General Act is required to render assistance to the Inspector General in the Inspector General's execution of his responsibilities. And the Inspector General is, among other things, required to keep the agency head currently informed of problems and to recommend policies to promote the economy and efficiency of the agency. The legislative history of the Inspector General Act, in particular the report of the Committee on Governmental Affairs, United States Senate, report number 95-1071 to accompany H.R. 8588, which I request be added to the record, states emphatically, quote, the committee believes that an Inspector General's efforts will be significantly impaired if he does not have a smooth working relationship with the department head. The committee continued, quoting the HEW Inspector General, quote, to be truly effective, the Inspector General must have a close relationship with the Secretary, enjoy his confidence and respect, and be responsive to his concerns, both as to his specific assignments and as to the Inspector General's overall function in the agency, end quote. The committee continued, the Inspector General can be the agency head's strong right arm in rooting out fraud, abuse, and waste, while maintaining the independence needed to honor his reporting obligations to Congress. The committee does not doubt that some tension can result from this relationship, but the committee believes that the potential advantages far outweigh the potential risks. The chair of the PCIe has issued guidance in 2004 and again in 2006 that encourages productive and respectful working relationships between agencies and inspectors generals. I also request that that guidance be submitted for the record. I gained the confidence of Administrator O'Keefe, and I have the confidence of Administrator Griffin. This is not because of lack of independence. In fact, there's been any number of instances when my view of matters differed from the Administrator or his senior staff, or when OIG investigations have related to the most senior officials of the agency. It is because of my demonstration of independence that these administrators express confidence in me, so the relationship has been exactly as anticipated by Congress when it enacted the Inspector General Act. I'm proud of the management initiatives that have been executed during my tenure as Inspector General, which have ensured that those matters most significant to NASA are well-resourced and managed. Our investigation into improprieties by the Boeing Corporation, which resulted in the recovery to NASA of over $100 million last summer, was an example of a matter that benefited from substantial OIG management involvement, including substantial attention from me. At NASA, I have taken the responsibilities of office under the Inspector General Act seriously and without compromise to root out and prevent fraud, waste, and abuse, and to promote the economy and efficiency of the agency. I've worked with NASA management in the manner contemplated by the Inspector General Act. I have upheld my oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. My staff and I have worked very hard to gain respect by building expertise in the areas in which we conduct our work, by ensuring that our work is performed in a fair and balanced manner, by making sure that the work is supported by law and relevant facts, and by making sure that the NASA OIG organization reflects the economy and efficiency in operations that we demand of the agency we oversee. As a result of this dedicated effort, I proudly stand behind the work of the NASA OIG. I believe the NASA OIG to be a much stronger organization today than when I became the NASA Inspector General. Thank you.
Mr. Cobb, I'm going to ask you the questions that Senator Chuck Grassley has stated in his statement that has been made a part of the record. And since he was not able to be here, and I quote, Mr. Cobb, do you believe that an Inspector General can continue to serve if he has lost the confidence of his staff and of the Congress?
There's two parts to that question. The first is the confidence of his staff. I do not believe that I have lost the confidence of my staff. As to Congress, I believe if Congress and those in Congress review the work of the Office of Inspector General and take that work, that the work is credible and it's excellent work, and I stand behind all of it.
His second question is, do you believe an Inspector General can continue to serve who has been found by an independent investigation to have abused his authority?
My statement, my written statement is clear on my views on the Integrity Committee's findings. I stand behind my written statement, and if the findings of the Integrity Committee are falsely based, then I don't see any problem with continuing to serve under those circumstances.
Well, now, are you disputing the findings of the Integrity Commission as an independent investigation that you have abused your authority?
Yes.
You're disputing that?
Yes.
You acknowledge that that's what the committee report said?
The committee report said I abused my authority insofar as, and I'm not quoting it exactly, but I created a hostile work environment as to one employee.
So you think you can continue to serve even though the independent investigation says that you abused your authority?
Yes, and I think the Integrity Committee itself recognized that by not making a recommendation regarding its findings to the PCIE chair.
Senator Grassley's third question is, do you believe an Inspector General can continue to serve if he is perceived as in the pockets of the people he is supposed to investigate?
I guess from my perspective, it depends on whose perception that is. The reality to me is important, and there is no work in our office that has been compromised in any way, shape, or form. So I'd be interested in discussing the work of our office, which I think has been outstanding during my tenure.
The next question from Senator Grassley is, do you believe an Inspector General can continue to serve if he has acknowledged verbally abusing staff on numerous occasions?
Again, I think that the premise of the question is, I don't accept the premise of the question. There hasn't been numerous occasions of berating a staff. There's a few instances.
So all of the testimony brought forth in the Integrity Committee's report, do you dispute that?
I believe, as my statement indicates, that the HUD Inspector General's recitation of facts reflects an attempt to obtain the opinions of many persons who did not like the accountability that I brought to the NASA Office of Inspector General with respect to the work of that office. And there was no effort by the HUD Office of Inspector General to produce a balanced report regarding relevant evidence.
Well, let's forget what then the Integrity Commission report has stated, and let me just ask you, did you use profanity in front of your employees?
Yes, I have.
Did you do the profanity in front of women?
Yes, I have.
The statements that were made by the previous witnesses, are those true with regard to the use of profanity and the gestures that you had made?
There were many statements made, certainly as regards the testimony of Deborah Herzog. there was at least one instance where I used profanity in her presence in an aggressive way, and I pounded the table, and I regret that.
Do you consider that verbally abusing staff?
I think that the characterization that was verbally abusive is a fair characterization with respect to that one incident.
But no other times?
No, I didn't say that. I believe that there were 3 or 4 other times in the 5 years that I've been the Inspector General where when I believed that either the activity of a particular person as regards me was disrespectful or was, and I don't use this in a legal sense, insubordinate, but nonetheless where a disregard for a determination or decision that I had been made was shown, and that occurred with Ms. Herzog.
I want to remind you of your obligations under the United States Code, number 18 USC 1001, to answer truthfully the questions propounded in a congressional hearing. And what we're trying to do is to get your perspective with regard to a series of allegations that are quite serious, that have been extensive. So Senator Grassley's concluding statement in his testimony, the honest answering of these questions should lead you to make a decision as to what is best for NASA and the American people. And so your conclusion is that you should stay as the Inspector General?
My conclusion is that I should stand up against an investigation that disregards the Constitution and due process concepts that are built into it. And I believe that when our government operates in a way that is abusive, that people should stand up against it.
And in your opinion, for you to remain as Inspector General, that's in the best interest of NASA and the American people?
Yes.
Chairman Miller?
Thank you. My vote has begun, but I do want to get in a few questions. Mr. Cobb, the Inspector General Act provides that the purpose of the act is to provide a means for keeping the head of the establishment, in this case NASA, and Congress fully and currently informed about problems and deficiencies. And I'm sure you're familiar with the quality standards for federal offices of Inspector General, which says that Inspector Generals report both to the head of their respective agencies and to the Congress. This dual reporting responsibility is the framework within which Inspector Generals perform their functions. Unique in government, dual reporting is the legislative safety net that protects the Inspector General's independence and objectivity. Do you agree with that requirement, that you report both to the head of the agency and to Congress?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Now, Senator Grassley's question was, can a Inspector General serve effectively if the Inspector General has lost the confidence of Congress? And your response basically was that you didn't think you had lost the confidence of Congress. Without regard to your personal circumstances, can't an Inspector General serve effectively if Congress has concluded that they cannot rely upon that Inspector General's work?
The Inspector General can continue to do the work, and there has been, and let me make absolutely clear that there has been no suggestion that the work of our office is anything other than first class.
I really thought that question could have been answered yes or no.
We put out a first class work product, and
So
we'll continue to do so until such time we will just continue to do that. There is no problem with the credibility of the work, and whether Congress chooses and elects to pick it up and read it is really up to Congress. We will keep congressional staff informed of our activities as we have throughout my tenure.
But your answer is, if we've lost confidence in you, it's our fault, not yours.
It's your decision. it's not anyone's fault. If it's your decision, there's not much I can do about that. I can just do my job.
In your written testimony, you questioned whether the PCIE report and their recommendations were within the authority of the PCIE. And again, the PCIE is composed of all the Inspector Generals. I believe this particular report was reviewed by 6 Inspector Generals, as reformed by the Inspector General of HUD. Is that correct?
It's close. It's not exactly right. There's an integrity committee. It has several members, 3 of whom are inspectors generals. There are 3 other members. One is the head of the Office of Government Ethics, the head of the Office of Special Counsel. There's the chair is the FBI chief of the criminal division, and there's others ex officio members who sit in on committee meetings.
All right. Well, do you accept these professional standards, the quality standards for Federal Office of Inspector General? Do you regard those as binding upon you? Do you regard those as setting forth for you what your professional obligations are in your role as Inspector General?
Yes, I would say that's good. That's guidance that I abide by.
It's guidance. It's not required, but it's advice?
It's guidance.
Okay. Mr. Cobb, 2 weeks ago, the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight in the House, the Science and Technology Committee, had a hearing about this mandatory all-hands meeting in the Inspector General's office. 2 witnesses from the agency, the Chief of Staff and the current counsel, Mr. Wiley. Mr. Wiley testified that the Chief of Staff handed him a stack of DVDs and said these DVDs should never have been made. You decide what to do with them, or some words to that effect. And he decided that he would destroy them because if he didn't destroy them, we would probably ask for them. Now, in ordinary circumstances, and this was the meeting where Administrator Griffin talked to the OIG staff, to your staff, about the finding of the PCIE committee with respect to your conduct and the recommendations of the PCIE committee and why he was not adopting those recommendations but doing something much less. Now, in ordinary circumstances, some kind of conduct like that, we would turn to the Inspector General and ask the Inspector General to look into it. Can we ask you to look into that?
Well, you certainly can ask, and whether we would undertake an investigation. I have staff reviewing our role and what role we might have in connection with that particular activity. But as you say, under normal circumstances, that was a very unusual meeting. Part of the problem that we would have, from my perspective, in connection with conducting an investigation in that case is all of the witnesses with respect to what occurred during that session are Office of Inspector General employees. Furthermore, there were several Office of Inspector General employees who were in possession of copies of the activity and volunteered to give them back, in fact, knowing that they were going to be destroyed. And so there are a number of issues associated with whether or not it would be appropriate for our office to be involved in an investigation of that activity. Right. But the matter is under review.
Mr. Cobb, you heard me read aloud to the previous panel from the quality standards for the Office of Inspector General, the provisions on personal impairments and external impairments. You said that you thought you were supposed to maintain a close relationship with the Inspector of NASA and the leadership of NASA. This provides personal impairments of staff members result from relationships and beliefs that might cause OIG staff to limit the extent of an inquiry, limit disclosure, or weaken or slant their work in any way. The testimony, which I think some of which you have not disputed, or some of it is written and is beyond dispute, is that it was frequently the case that you would ask in advance what you wanted the management to have you look at. You would send them findings before you issued them. You would edit based upon their recommendations. And that you met Mr. O'Keefe and Mr. Pastrick regularly for lunch, frequently in the dining room, weekly for lunch, frequently in the dining room of NASA, where every employee in the place could see you there together. You met Mr. O'Keefe for drinks in his office. You played golf with him. On and on, you heard both Mr. Bryan and Dr. Light say that that was a flagrant violation of the requirement that an Inspector General avoid personal impairments to their objectivity and independence. But you disagree with their conclusion.
I don't disagree with the conclusion or the tenor of the guidance that's in the quality standards. I don't accept all of the premises of the question that you asked. And I would like to say that glaringly absent from all of the testimony that occurred earlier today is the fact that I do work with my senior staff in an extraordinarily collaborative way. So, for example, when I was asked whether I could go play, whether I would be playing golf with Mr. O'Keefe, I ran that by the 27-year counsel to the Office of Counsel to the Inspector General, and I discussed it at great length with my deputy, Tom Howard. Tom Howard's name hasn't been mentioned. He's been with our office for 5 years, or 4.5 years, or 4 3/4 years, a 33-year veteran of the government accountability, or 24 years at Government Accountability Office, 5 years at the DOT IG, intimately familiar with all the Yellow Book standards. He's been in the auditing business for now 33 years. There wasn't a decision that was discussed earlier today that I didn't have Tom Howard closely involved in terms of analyzing the issues that were present.
Mr. Cobb, doesn't all of this testimony bother you? Doesn't the Integrity Committee, made up of other professional IGs, doesn't this bother you? Doesn't it give you some pause to think that you might not be right all the time?
There are a couple of questions you've asked. I'm certainly not right all the time. I make mistakes routinely, and that's why I have a very collaborative method of dealing with issues in our office involving, as I just mentioned, Tom Howard very closely and other members of the senior staff. As for pause, as you know, Senator, you have sought investigation of me for more than 2 years now, and I've been under investigation, an investigation that's been extraordinarily costly, involving more than a dozen HUD OIG investigators looking through all of my email, basically looking for anything that can be used to stain my reputation. So yes, I have had substantial pause in connection with that activity.
Since you raised the issue, I want the record to reflect that one of the roles of an elected official is when constituents refer complaints to have those complaints referred to the proper authorities. You just made a statement that I had made an investigation on you. That's not true. The Integrity Commission, which is a lawfully constituted body, is the one who made the investigation. The complaints that this office and other members of this committee have received have been referred to them, and that's what started this whole process. And you are in a, well, I want you just to, rather than draw any conclusions.
May I address my comment and your response to it?
Please.
What I referred to was a May 12, 2005 letter from you to Administrator Griffin asking for an investigation of work of the NASA Office of Inspector General in connection with a pilot matter down at the Langley Research Center.
That's correct. And that was...
That's what I was referring to.
Okay. Those were the first complaints that we were getting. And then as the complaints continued to come in, then it was clear that there was a legally constituted authority in order to do the investigation. The investigation hadn't been done by this committee.
No, I understand that.
All right. Let me go over a number of issues. And at the end of the day, I think what we're trying to get here is what's good for NASA. NASA is this little agency that's on the cutting edge, that's running a high-risk operation, and they certainly don't need any side distractions like's been going on. So let's further explore. On December the 8th, 2004, a team of your investigators working with the FBI and an assistant U.S. attorney obtained a search warrant that was signed by a U.S. magistrate federal judge. The next day, the investigation team assembled at the Stennis Space Center as they prepared to serve the search warrant in this criminal investigation. That morning, you ordered your investigators not to proceed with the search warrant. Would you share for the committee why you did that?
Yes, sir. And as a background, and just in terms of philosophy, I think this is an example of how you'll find that when Alan Lee of the Government Accountability Office said, "I'm the most independent Inspector General that he's ever seen," this is an instance where I reflect that independence. I reviewed a affidavit, I believe, in support of the search warrant which had been signed. Upon my review, read it, it was brought to me, I looked at it, I couldn't understand what crime had been committed with respect to the facts that were alleged to have occurred. And I asked whether and what the crime was that was occurred, and I did not get an answer. Nobody knew. I did not think that the facts that were alleged in that affidavit constituted a crime. I had a discussion with Ms. Herzog about that. She, as she testified earlier, indicated that that's in effect a matter for the defendant in a criminal case to litigate whether or not service of the search warrant is appropriate. I asked for the counsel to the IG to come in and join us in the conversation that we were having. My recollection of these circumstances was that the counsel came in. I asked him if he had seen the search warrant, and he said, yes. I was wondering what the crime was that underpinned that search warrant. So, I'll go back because there was something that I considered offensive. When I asked Ms. Herzog what the crime was, she asked, or she told me that I couldn't ask that question, that to ask that question was interfering with an investigation or the service of a search warrant and intimating what she said today, that it was an obstruction of justice. I had a question as to whether or not a search warrant, which was going to be served on a citizen of the United States, happened to be at a NASA center, whether it was a legal and valid search warrant, and I was told that I couldn't ask the question. I, again, had my counsel give me his opinion. He also questioned whether or not there had been, whether there was a suggestion of a crime in connection with that activity. We had a vigorous debate as to what we should do under those circumstances. The result of that debate was that my counsel to the IG, would personally communicate with the Assistant United States Attorney. He did, and was told that the Assistant United States Attorney was very comfortable with the service of the search warrant, and we did not take the matter any further.
How many days was the search warrant delayed?
I don't believe it was delayed 1 day.
So in this situation, even though it had been investigated by the FBI with the judgment of an assistant USA and a federal judge, you rendered their decision wrong and yours right to delay the process.
I wouldn't say that I said that my view was right. I had a question as to what the crime was that was alleged to have occurred in connection with this activity, and And I think that my recollection was that the answer was theft of proprietary information. And the problem was, from my standpoint, was the information had been created by a government employee on government time. And my limited knowledge of that particular area was that information produced by a government employee on government time is not proprietary information. So if someone took it and used it for another purpose, that would not be theft of proprietary information. So I asked the question of whether or not this constitutes a crime. And that's the basis for this notion that I was somehow improperly interfering with an investigation. But I must say, this is reflective of my independent attitude when it comes to asking questions that I think are appropriate under the circumstances.
If that were the only time, that would be innocent enough. But that is just one of a pattern, because the situation repeated itself on June the 30th of '05 in a criminal investigation at the Marshall Space Flight Center. Your agents, along with the agents of the FBI, were preparing to serve a search warrant that had been sworn by an assistant U.S. attorney and signed by a magistrate judge. And again, you halted the search warrant moments before it was to be served. Why did you do that?
Well, again, I don't necessarily accept the premise, all the premises of the question that you posed, but I also admit that my recollection of exactly what occurred with respect to that particular search warrant, and whether it was even a search warrant at that time or was it a contemplated search warrant, I'm not that familiar. I do remember having a question, and the fundamental question I think I was getting into in connection with that one was whether we were better off serving a search warrant or going and gathering the evidence, which we would have been able to do at night without a search warrant.
Well, Mr. Cobb, see, this is where you get into trouble, because this was a different assistant U.S. attorney than the one in the Stennis case. It was a different federal judge than the Stennis case. And again, you inserted your opinion instead of an assistant U.S. prosecutor, the FBI, your agents, and a federal judge. And that's where you start to get into trouble. And part of the execution of criminal law is the timeliness of the search warrants. Delay gives time for suspects to dispose of evidence. Now, how much of a delay was there in this particular time?
I don't recall, but I assure you that that's something that we would have discussed at great length at the time, and I do not believe that there was any negative impact associated with ensuring whether or not this was an appropriate use of NASA OIG resources in connection with this activity.
There's where you get yourself in trouble. You are interfering with the judgment of the criminal law system of a series of people who, by law, are charged with the responsibility of carrying out that law. And if there is a delay in that search warrant, there is the distinct possibility of the loss of evidence. Now, on your testimony just a few minutes ago with regard to the Stennis case, you said the search warrant wasn't delayed more than one day. I want to call your attention to page 117 of the IC report. It says, Burnell stated Cobb called Houghton and allowed them to execute, this is on the Stennis case, called them to execute the search warrant at about 2 p.m. on December the 9th, '04. After the search, Burnell recalled discussing with Houghton that the subjects may have been alerted, the subjects of the search warrant may have been alerted to the impending search and possibly removed the evidence being sought. The Radiance employees were not surprised when the warrant was executed. Burnell states that he believes the element of surprise was lost because of the delay. People charged in the criminal justice system with carrying out the law. This is where you're getting yourself in trouble. Interposing your judgment for that of the legal authorities. Let me ask you about the command destruct system. STS-111 launched on June the 5th, 2002, and one of the two required range safety systems was malfunctioning. That's the command destruct system, which can destroy the solid rocket boosters in case of going off track. Your office did an investigation into that incident. Is that correct?
There was consideration of issues by Mr. Carson and another gentleman on our audit staff.
I don't understand your answer.
We're divided fundamentally into two operational organizational elements, investigation and audit. This was not an investigation under our Office of Investigations. It was in our audit shop.
Well, let me continue. It was determined that an Air Force general went through back channels to the Kennedy Space Center director, telling him that the range was green for launch when the range safety officers were actually reporting red, which means that both systems were not go for launch, and that's a launch criteria. Did your office complete an investigation in this incident?
I don't believe so.
And why not?
I was briefed on these issues, I believe, in February of 2005, along with my deputy and other senior managers in the NASA Office of Inspector General. You must realize that Mr. Carson was, during the course of the time he worked in the NASA Office of Inspector General, 3 and 4 levels below me down the chain of command. So all of those people up the chain of command would have been present for the briefing. The fact was that in this instance, the Air Force Office of Inspector General had 2.5 years previously already considered the allegation that there was some impropriety associated with the conduct of the Air Force General, and had concluded, quote, that the general, quote, acted within his authority for range and public safety when he made the risk assessment and determined the range was a, quote unquote, go for launch. Since there was no violation, any further investigation into this incident is not warranted. That was 2.5 years prior to the time that the matter was brought to my attention in a briefing. This was an Air Force general executing his authorities as an Air Force general, not on detail or assignment to NASA. It's interesting, I think, that when I was asked by the HUD Office of Inspector General about this same incident in the end of June of 2006, that Administrator Griffin had, in connection with a launch just prior to that interview, down at the Space Center, had overruled and bypassed the recommendation of his Chief Safety Officer and I believe Chief Engineer to proceed with a launch, notwithstanding the fact that they indicated that there was a no-go. So, you know, people make command decisions and are responsible and accountable for them. And to me, dedication of resources to find out whether or not this particular general, who had retired 2 3/4 years earlier, had exercised proper authority in a matter that was questionably under the jurisdiction of the NASA Office of Inspector General, did not, in my opinion, but also that of my senior staff, warrant additional examination.
So you felt like that the Air Force had investigated this and it was a matter that was taken care of?
Yes, as regards the actions of the general. There were other issues that were legitimate issues that were relevant to this that were being considered, and that was the communication between the range and NASA officials, and to what extent those communications were acting in a way that kept people informed of what they needed to be informed of. And there was a red team that had been, and quite possibly as a result of the inquiries that Mr. Carson and his colleague were making, there was a red team that had been established by the Air Force, a joint NASA Air Force red team, to consider the issues. They made recommendations, they established new procedures, and the issue that was most concerning about communication between the Air Force and NASA as concerned the range, the safety of the range, the safety of the astronauts, that those issues were addressed, and we examined that, and we believe that they were addressed.
And you all did an investigation on that, on the issue of communication?
We conducted audit activities in connection with that communication, yes.
If that were to occur again, what would you do?
If what was to occur again?
Same thing, that they launch and both of them aren't activated.
Well, one thing that I would do that I don't know that the HUD Office of Inspector General did, in fact, I don't believe that they did, is I would consult with those people who were intimately familiar with the range safety issues. And to the Integrity Committee and the HUD Office of Inspector General, I made a fairly significant list of people who would be familiar with those issues, and I don't believe any of them were spoken to in connection with these activities.
Let me tell you what the difference is between you drawing a parallel with Dr. Griffin making the decision to launch. In the one case here, we have an Air Force general overriding his Air Force officer who has said that they are red for launch, and the Air Force general says they are go or green for launch, and then using back channels to the KSC center director. That, by the way, was reminiscent of all of the misinformation in the loss of Challenger back in 1986. That's one set of circumstances. That is not parallel to the set of circumstances with which you just accused Dr. Griffin, where there is a flight readiness review with all the people present, all discussing their issues, being on the table in front of everyone, and with the administrator making the final decision in front of everybody, and then going back to the two that said no go and getting their approval to go. It's a totally different situation. One's secretive and back channels. The other is a recognized procedure in the launch operations and is completely out in the open among all the flight readiness team. Huge difference. Let me ask you about let's put up that chart again on the work product. Why don't you just give us some comments about that in how you compare to your two predecessors. This is the work product of your shop, the IG shop.
Well, I can see the graph from here, and for purposes of discussion,
give him a copy of that, please.
For purposes of discussion, let's assume that it's an accurate reflection of audit productivity. Thank you. To me, and maybe I could be criticized for this, the number of audits our office publishes is is to me not necessarily is not my indicia of whether or not we're successfully carrying out our mission. And in fact, I'd say when I joined as Inspector General at NASA, the metric that was utilized for analyzing whether or not our office was effectively carrying out its mission was the number of recommendations it was making. As a point of fact, I didn't think that that was an appropriate metric for our activities. And furthermore, to me, the quality of the work was much more important. And in that respect, there might, especially if you look at the chart, see that there was a substantial number of audits that were generated 3/4 of the way through Roberta Gross's tenure. Interestingly, there was a significant downward slope towards the end. But in any event, the Office of Inspector General was generating many, many recommendations which were being accepted by the agency and then not implemented. And it became such a problem that the Internal Control Council at NASA identified it as an internal control weakness of the agency, that it had approximately 500 outstanding audit recommendations that it was not implementing. Office of Inspector General was issuing recommendations. Agency wasn't implementing them. That was a problem. And I think that that problem was caused by many things, and I don't know that you want me to go into great detail on that, but part of it was the quality of the recommendations and whether or not they were implementable from a standpoint of doing right by NASA. So from my perspective, when I became the Inspector General, first thing that I did was I wanted, and I recognized that I did not have a substantial background in audit activities, so I hired a deputy who had, at that time, 28 years of audit experience to help me in managing the audit activity of the office. And what we worked very hard to do was to make sure that our audit work was, as Mr. Carson indicated earlier, that our work was top-notch.
But you would acknowledge that on the number of audit reports, that your high of 19 is less than the average of the previous two IGs.
I acknowledge that the numbers here are less than what occurred under Bill Colvin and Roberta Gross.
Well, let's talk about safety-related audits. In the past 6 months, the only safety-related audit product was not a report, but it was a memorandum on stair access trucks used at the Dryden Research Center. Is that correct?
I'm not sure exactly which audits that we've published. We've published some significant audits in safety in the last in the recent period. Space shuttle program problem reporting corrective action process at Kennedy Center Space Center needs improvement. That was one.
Okay, I'm reading from Appendix B of the Office of the Inspector General Semi-Annual Report, October the 1st, 06 to March 31st, 07. I think this is your report. During the period April the 1st through September the 30th, the Office of Audits issued 19 products. And then in the audit area of safety, there is a final memorandum on the review of the access stair trucks located at the Dryden Flight Research Center, and that's the only thing under audit safety.
We have many ongoing projects that are safety related. You know, the idea that, you know, again, I'd say that the The HUD Inspector General's report as regards any safety-related issue is remarkably deficient insofar as I identified a substantial number of people with safety expertise at NASA as people who potentially should be considered as witnesses, and the HUD Office of Inspector General did not interview a single one of them.
Well, it's a high-risk little agency that safety is absolutely key. This is one of the reasons you've got to have an independent IG. You've got to have an IG that's looking for those safety problems other than access stair trucks at Dryden.
Senator, under my leadership, the NASA Office of Inspector General hired technical staff, safety experts. We've got somebody at the MMT meeting going on today regarding activities, keeping us apprised of issues that relate to shuttle launch safety. We've got people now in the NASA Office of Inspector General who are engineering and technical experts, aerospace technologists, safety folks, that we didn't have when I started as NASA Inspector General. And it's because of my concern that we have competent, independent ability to ascertain what are real safety issues that we need to address, that we now have those people. There is no limit on the amount of attention, dedication of resources that my office has given to safety. And on the investigation side, I'd say that recently, and I think that you'll see in that semi-annual report, many of our criminal prosecutions are parts and test fraud related. We had a case recently involving the falsification of test data for spacesuit batteries. We had another case where several people went to jail on significant prison sentences, in addition to substantial fines associated with making false statements relating to and altered test results on metal materials received relating to the space shuttle wings. And I would just say that there's been no lack of dedication to safety-related issues at NASA under my leadership.
Well, I'm only looking at your report, and of course the question is begged, respectfully, audit area, financial management, you have 4. Audit area, procurement, you have 2. Audit area, space operations and explanation, 1. Audit area, other, 1. Audit area, quality control reviews, a couple. But under audit area, safety, the access stair trucks. So I just simply point out from your own report, and someone like me in this committee has got to raise these things, because safety is the absolute. We can't afford the loss of another shuttle, because you know what happens if that's the case. Let me ask you about what another issue that I stated in my opening comments. This one really concerns me. This is the theft of a $1.9 billion set of rocket plans. And it was never reported. And who knows who has that? It's allegation number 28, the theft of the ITAR-sensitive data from a computer at the Marshall Space Flight Center. The data involved was detailed design information on the shuttle main engines, which are the most technologically advanced around in the world, as well as design information for NASA's new advanced engine. And the intellectual property value of that is almost $2 billion. And the investigation into that incident ultimately determined that the data was downloaded by a hacker in South America or France and for a period of time posted on the internet that anybody could have gotten it. Anyone and everyone could have gotten it. And Lord knows who got it. And there are some folks, I can tell you, sitting in my capacity as the chairman of the Strategic Systems Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee, there are sure folks on planet Earth that we don't want to have these kind of rocket designs that are very advanced, namely folks like North Korea and Iran. Now, 4 years after the incident, the Department of Defense was finally asked to evaluate the national security implication of the compromised data. The request didn't come from your office, but from the HUD investigators who were investigating your conduct. And the Pentagon's conclusions are shown in Senate Exhibit 3. Do you recall any time during 02 or 03 a member of your staff recommending that this incident be reported to the State Department as is required under law?
Well, first, I don't accept your premise that this is required under law.
The gravity of this situation you don't think requires the reporting of this to the United States State Department? I don't. The premise of your question was that there's a requirement under law to report this to the Department of State. Well,
you may
dispute it on the law. What is your opinion? Do you think it should have been reported to another agency?
Our office, as soon as we were informed of this activity, we worked in concert with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, the FBI, the NIPC, the National Infrastructure Protection Center, was aware of it. We worked with international authorities. There was no act that our office did not take that it should have in connection with this activity. There was no serious discussion in our office or presented to me regarding a reporting requirement to the State Department. And in fact, to this day, nobody has brought any specific indication of agency requirements to report this information. But I do understand that in August of 2002, there was a conversation between the director of the Export Control Office at NASA with the Department of State, who indicated that voluntary disclosure under the ITAR was not required.
So that's your position?
That's my position.
All right, a senior member of your staff reports that you worked with NASA to have the data classified so that its loss wouldn't be publicly disclosed. Is that true?
I don't believe that that is the case. I believe that there might have been a discussion back at the time as to whether or not, for example, the kind of conversation that we're having here today is something that should be made public. When there are national security concerns, is it national security information, a question about classification often rises and is dealt with, as every other issue is, intelligently and disposed of.
So it's your position that you weren't required to report this to the State Department. You've stated that. And can't you see, you're getting into trouble with judgment here. Something of enormous defense importance to the United States, and you're not sharing it with another agency whose responsibility it is to protect the secrets of the United States. Can't you see where all of this controversy has stirred up and the chain of these things?
Again, our office took every action that was appropriate under the circumstances. The National Infrastructure Protection Center, under Presidential Decision Directive 63, the NIPC was interagency operation located at the FBI. It was created in 1998. It was the focal point for the government's efforts to warn of and respond to cyber attacks and served as the national critical infrastructure threat assessment, warning, vulnerability, and law enforcement investigation and response entity. To my knowledge, they knew about it. The FBI knew about it. The DCIS were aware of it. International authorities, appropriate international authorities, were aware of it. So there was no limitation placed on any member of my staff in terms of communication to any person about, and these communications were taking place not at my direction, but as a matter of normal course in the exercise of duties of staff members in our office.
Chairman Miller.
Thank you. I just have a few more questions. Mr. Cobb, the finding of the PCIE was based predominantly on testimony and evidence given by employees of your office. And you have said you are now reluctant to talk to your employees, that they twist your words, you think that they said unfavorable things to you about you because you came in and found an office that did not meet your standards, and you whipped them into shape, and you insisted that they improve, and that was why they resented you. You do sound somewhat like Humphrey Bogart in the Caine Mutiny when you describe your staff. But I have not heard an explanation for why you think your peers, why other inspector generals have been so critical. In your testimony, there is a tone of grievance. With having given 11 hours of testimony, although in hearing your testimony today, I think it might have been shorter if yes or no answers, questions that contemplated a yes or no answer had gotten a yes or no answer. You obviously think you were treated unfairly, and it was an inspection, it was an investigation conducted by the Inspector General of HUD, your peer. It was reviewed by other peers, other inspectors general. Why do you think they treated you so badly? I cannot figure a motive for their treatment of you if it is as bad as you believe it is.
I can only say you request speculation on my part. I think that all I can say is, as regards the investigation, I've gone to great lengths in my statement and my attachment Exhibit B to reflect the falsities that are reflected in the Integrity Committee's report. And I think that you need to direct that question to them on why they would conduct an investigation that would result in such falsities being published. I would go further to say that you will find no work of the NASA Office of Inspector General that has those types of false statements included in it in terms of the important work that we do both on the investigation side and on the audit side, but particularly as regards administrative investigations of NASA employees or the addressing of whistleblower complaints, of which we've received many. We go to great lengths to get our work right, and I can't say the same for what is reflected in the HUD OIG/Integrity Committee report. There's this notion that the NASA Office of Inspector General was the land of milk and honey until Inspector General Robert Cobb arrived. And let me suggest that in this very difficult business that IGs straddle barbed wire fences that we heard about earlier, which doesn't sound particularly comfortable but may be apropos. Bill Colvin, who was an Inspector General at NASA, was forced out as a result of allegations made by staff. Roberta Gross, and this is, I'm not making any statement about Roberta Gross or Bill Colvin or their competency or ability to do the job. I'm just saying, giving a little bit of insight to the NASA Office of Inspector General. Recently, there was a document from a year 2000 EEO case, which was 2 years before I came. And a footnote in that document It's important to know that the complainant sought a class action alleging that OIG employees over 40 years of age were being systematically discriminated against. The EEO counselor's report included statements from 9 OIG employees who complained of discriminatory non-selections and identified an additional 13 OIG employees who were interested in speaking with an EEO counselor regarding alleged discriminatory non-selections. That's 22 NASA OIG employees in the year 2000 concerned about discriminatory non-selections. And I don't suggest and present that for the truth of the matter, only that, again, and Roberta Gross had Integrity Committee complaints filed against her as well. This is part of the territory with respect to being an Inspector General. What I stand for, whether you're talking about search warrants or you're talking about the work of the NASA Office of Inspector General, is that we get the work right based on law and the facts. And there has not been any, and I credit not myself, but the NASA OIG staff for getting the work right. There has not been any suggestion that any work that we've worked on we didn't get right.
Okay. I want to thank you for your indulgence. I want to thank you for the time. It's with a heavy heart that we leave this hearing after 24 complaints, 79 allegations, a number of career law enforcement officials at HUD, Office of Inspector General, and 7 members of the Integrity Committee. And you have asserted that those people are all wrong and that you're all right. And so I go back to the question that Senator Grassley asked us to propound, is what are the honest answers to the questions that lead us to a decision about what's in the best interest of NASA, America's space program, and the American people. And that's a judgment that you're going to have to live with. The meeting is adjourned.